Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey back to 1241, a year when Europe stood on the edge of absolute annihilation. Imagine waking up one morning to find that everything you knew, every castle, every church, every kingdom from Poland to France, could be wiped off the map in a matter of weeks, not by plague, not by famine, but by an army so terrifying, so unstoppable, that people believed they were demons sent from hell itself. This isn't fantasy. This actually happened. And what saved Western civilization wasn't courage, wasn't faith, wasn't even military genius. It was something far more unexpected, something that would change the course of human history forever. So settle in, because the story you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about how close we came to living in a completely different world. Now, before we dive deeper into this incredible story, I need a small favor from you. If you're enjoying what you're hearing right now, if you're curious about where this is going, could you hit that subscribe button? And if you really want to support what we do here, a like would mean the world to me. Oh, and I'm genuinely curious. Where are you watching this from right now? Your bedroom in Texas? A rainy night in London? Maybe you're pulling an all-nighter in Tokyo. Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from you guys. All right, dim those lights, get comfortable. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let's step back in time together. Tonight's story is going to be unforgettable. So let me set the scene for you. It's early 1241. If you're living in Europe, your world is, well, it's complicated. You've got kingdoms fighting kingdoms, princes stabbing their cousins in the back, the Pope trying to organize crusades that nobody really wants to go on anymore. Germany is a patchwork of arguing duchies. Poland is fractured into rival territories. Hungary is dealing with internal drama. France and England, they're too busy hating each other to notice what's happening in the East. In other words, Europe is a mess. A beautiful, chaotic, completely disorganized mess. But here's the thing. Nobody in Paris, nobody in Vienna, nobody sitting in their stone castles sipping wine and arguing about theology. None of them have any idea what's about to hit them. Because while Europe is busy with its little family feuds, something absolutely monstrous is moving toward them from the East. Something that makes all their petty wars look like children fighting over toys. Let me paint you a picture of what people in Eastern Europe were seeing by late 1240. Imagine you're a farmer in Russia. Maybe you're harvesting grain, thinking about winter, minding your own business. Then one day, you see smoke on the horizon. Lots of smoke. The next day, refugees start flooding into your village, wild-eyed, traumatized, babbling about horsemen. But not normal horsemen. These riders, they say, can fire arrows while galloping at full speed. They can ride for days without stopping. They drink blood and eat human flesh, or so the rumors go. You think it's exaggeration. Has to be, right? People always exaggerate during war. Then the horsemen arrive, and you realize the rumors weren't exaggerations. If anything, they didn't capture how truly terrifying this was. The Mongols, that's who was coming. And by 1241, they had already done something that seemed impossible. They'd conquered more territory than the Roman Empire at its height. Think about that for a second. The Romans took centuries to build their empire. The Mongols, they'd created something twice as large in just a few decades. From the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Europe, one contiguous empire, the largest land empire in human history, and now they were knocking on Europe's door. Europeans called them Tartars, from Tartarus, the deepest, darkest pit of hell in Greek mythology. They weren't entirely wrong. Contemporary chroniclers described them as the devil's horsemen. They wrote about how the Mongols appeared like a storm of locusts darkening the sky with arrows, leaving nothing but ashes and silence in their wake. Here's what's absolutely wild. Most of Europe didn't even know the Mongols existed until they were already burning down cities in Poland and Hungary. There was no CNN, no internet, no way to get real-time information. News travelled by horse, by merchant, by rumour. So by the time people in Western Europe heard about this threat, multiple kingdoms had already fallen. Imagine living in France or England and hearing these fragmented, terrifying reports. There are invaders from the east. They've destroyed the Russian principalities. Kiev has fallen. Poland is next. And you're sitting there thinking, who? Who are these people? Where did they come from? Let me give you some context on what had already happened before 1241, because this is important for understanding just how screwed Europe was. Between 1237 and 1240, the Mongols had systematically destroyed every major Russian principality. We're talking about some of the most powerful kingdoms in Eastern Europe. Ryazan, gone. Vladimir, obliterated. Moscow, burned to the ground. Yes, Moscow, which at that time was just a small town, but still. And then Kiev, the mother of all Russian cities, the jewel of Eastern Europe. The Mongols showed up in December 1240 and absolutely annihilated it. Contemporary accounts say that after the Mongols left Kiev, the city was so thoroughly destroyed that years later, travellers could barely tell where it had been. One chronicler wrote that the skulls and bones of the dead covered the fields like snow in winter. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's what actually happened. And here's the terrifying part. The force that destroyed all of these powerful kingdoms. It was essentially a scouting party. The real Mongol army hadn't even arrived yet. Now, while all this carnage is happening in Russia, something important occurs that will become the excuse for the main invasion. About 40,000 people from a nomadic group called the Cumans, picture them as skilled horsemen, warriors themselves. They flee westward from the Mongol advance, and they end up in Hungary, begging King Bela IV for protection. Bela, being a decent guy, takes them in. He even lets them convert to Christianity, figures they can help defend the kingdom. Seems like a smart move, right? Get some experienced horsemen on your side, but to the Mongols this is an insult. See, the Mongols considered the Cumans their subjects, rebellious subjects, but subjects nonetheless. So when Hungary takes them in, the Mongol leadership sees this as Hungary harbouring fugitives, rebels against Mongol authority. And the Mongols don't do diplomatic protests. They don't file complaints with the UN. There is no UN. What they do is simple. They add you to the list of places that need to be conquered. So by early 1241, the stage is set for one of the most lopsided military campaigns in human history. And the scary part? Europe has no idea what's about to hit them. Let me give you a sense of how unprepared Europe was. The military doctrine of European knights at this time was essentially put on really heavy armour, get on a big horse, form a line, and charge at the enemy while shouting about God and glory. It had worked pretty well against other Europeans. It had even worked decently in the Crusades against Middle Eastern armies. But the Mongols fought in a way that would make a modern military strategist nod in approval. They used reconnaissance. They gathered intelligence. They coordinated multiple armies across thousands of miles. They used psychological warfare. They had a communication system using flags and whistles that could relay commands instantly across a battlefield. European knights didn't even have a way to communicate with the infantry fighting beside them. They just charged and hoped for the best. It's like watching a UFC fighter step into the ring against someone who's never learned any actual fighting techniques, who just plans to rush forward swinging wildly. Except in this case, the UFC fighter has studied your every move, knows your weaknesses, and has prepared a strategy specifically designed to exploit them. One more thing that made Europe especially vulnerable: they were divided. Fatally, catastrophically divided. When you're facing an existential threat, you need unity. You need cooperation. You need everyone to put aside their petty differences and work together. Europe couldn't do that. Poland was broken into rival duchies that could barely stand each other. Germany was a jigsaw puzzle of competing princes. Hungary and Austria had terrible relations. Nobody trusted anybody else. The Mongols, meanwhile, were united under a single command structure, following a single strategy, working toward a single goal. It's no contest, really. It's like watching a professional orchestra perform a complex symphony, and on the other side of the stage, you've got a bunch of talented musicians who refuse to play together and keep arguing about who should be first violin. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating and truly terrifying. The man orchestrating this invasion, the strategic genius behind it all, wasn't some young hotshot general looking to make his name. He was 65 years old, so old and heavy that horses couldn't carry him anymore, so his soldiers had to transport him to the battlefield in a cart. His name was Subutai, and he was about to execute one of the most brilliant military campaigns in human history. A campaign so sophisticated that military academies still study it today. But we'll get to him in a moment, because right now I want you to understand the atmosphere in Europe as winter turned to spring in 1241. If you were paying attention, if you were one of the few people who understood what was happening in the East, you would have felt a growing sense of dread, like watching a tsunami form on the horizon and realizing there's nowhere to run. The Mongols weren't just coming to raid. They weren't coming to steal some treasure and leave. They were coming to conquer, permanently. They wanted to reach what they called the Great Sea, what we know as the Atlantic Ocean. They wanted all of it, all of Europe, and based on their track record, based on what they'd already accomplished, there was absolutely no reason to think they couldn't do it. So as we stand here in early 1241 on the threshold of invasion, Europe is like a house made of kindling, and the Mongols are the spark that's about to set it ablaze. Kingdoms that have stood for centuries are about to face an enemy they don't understand, can't predict, and cannot defeat using conventional warfare. The storm is coming, and it's going to be unlike anything Europe has ever seen. Now, you might be wondering, if the Mongols were so unstoppable, if Europe was so unprepared, how is it that we're not all speaking Mongolian right now? How did Western civilization survive? That's the question, isn't it? And the answer, the real answer, is going to shock you. Because it has nothing to do with military might, nothing to do with divine intervention, and everything to do with something so random, so unpredictable, that if you wrote it in a fiction book, editors would reject it for being too convenient. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We need to understand who these Mongols actually were, where they came from, and most importantly, we need to meet the 65-year-old military genius who designed this entire campaign. Because this man, Subutai, is someone you've probably never heard of. But you should have. Oh, you absolutely should have. He conquered more territory than any commander in history. He won more battles than Napoleon. He coordinated military operations across distances that would make Alexander the Great's head spin. And yet for 700 years, Western history basically forgot he existed. Why? Well, that's another fascinating part of this story. But first, we need to understand the machine he was commanding. The Mongol military wasn't just an army, it was a revolution in warfare. And in our next part, we're going to break down exactly what made them so terrifyingly effective. We're going to look at how Genghis Khan built this incredible war machine, how his son Ögedei refined it, and how they created something that, by 1241, was essentially unstoppable. We're talking about tactical innovations that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 600 years. We're talking about a level of military organization that made Roman legions look disorganized. And then we're going to meet Subutai himself, the blacksmith's son who became the greatest general in history, the man who was about to unleash a campaign so brilliant, so devastating, that it would make Poland and Hungary look like practice runs. Because April 1241 is coming, and with it, 2 battles that will decide the fate of an entire continent. So stay with me, keep those lights dim, get comfortable. Because this story is just beginning, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Alright, so we've set the stage. Europe in 1241, completely unprepared, fractured, vulnerable. Now let's talk about what was actually coming for them, and more importantly, how it got built in the first place. Because here's something most people don't understand about the Mongol invasions. This wasn't some random horde of barbarians who got lucky. This was a precision-engineered military machine that had been decades in the making. Think of it less like a wildfire and more like a Swiss watch. Every piece perfectly designed, perfectly placed, working in harmony toward a single purpose. And it all started with one man. You know his name, Genghis Khan. Now, I'm not going to tell you Genghis Khan's entire life story tonight. We'd be here for hours. But I need you to understand what he created, because by 1241, 14 years after his death, his system was still running like clockwork. Actually, it was running better than ever. How many organizations do you know that work better after their founder dies? Not many, right? That's the genius of what Genghis built. When Genghis died in 1227, he didn't leave behind a typical medieval kingdom where everyone fights over the throne and the whole thing falls apart in a generation. Nope. He left behind something unprecedented, a fully functional empire with systems, structures, and most importantly, a meritocracy that actually worked. Let me explain what I mean by that. In Europe, if you wanted to be a military commander, you basically needed to be born into the right family. Didn't matter if you were brilliant or an idiot. If you were the Duke's son, congratulations, you're leading troops. The Mongols? They thought that was insane. Genghis Khan established a simple rule. You advance based on ability, not bloodline. You could be the son of a blacksmith, and we'll meet someone exactly like that in a minute. And if you showed talent, loyalty, and results, you could end up commanding armies that conquered kingdoms. Can you imagine how revolutionary that was? In 1200s Asia and Europe, where literally everything was about who your father was, the Mongols created a system where talent actually mattered. It's like they invented corporate meritocracy 700 years early. And that system produced something terrifying, the most efficient, most deadly, most innovative military force the world had ever seen. So when Genghis Khan died, his third son Ögedei took over as the Great Khan. Now, Ögedei wasn't the oldest son. That was Jochi, who had died the year before. Wasn't the most warlike. That was probably Chagatai. But Ögedei had something equally important. He was a brilliant administrator who understood that empires aren't just conquered, they're managed. Ögedei looked at the vast territories his father had conquered, from Korea to Persia, and he thought, okay, we've got this massive empire. Now how do we make it actually work? And here's where it gets interesting. While European kings were building castles and arguing with the Pope, Ögedei was building infrastructure. He established the YAM system. Think of it as the ancient version of FedEx, except way more impressive. relay stations every 25 miles across the entire empire, with fresh horses, supplies, food, and messengers ready to go 24/7. A message could travel from Mongolia to Persia, we're talking thousands of miles, in about 3 days. 3 days. At a time when it took weeks for a letter to get from Paris to Rome, the Mongols had basically invented high-speed communication. Why does this matter for our story? Because in 1241, when multiple Mongol armies are going to attack Europe from different directions, hundreds of miles apart, they're going to coordinate their movements with precision. They're going to know exactly where each other are, exactly what each other is doing. Meanwhile, European armies often didn't even know where their own allies were until they literally ran into them on the road. But the YAM system was just the beginning. Ögedei standardized military organization across the entire empire. Every unit of 10 soldiers had a leader. Every unit of 100 had a commander. Every unit of 1,000 had a general. And every unit of 10,000, called a tumen, was led by a senior general who reported directly to the Khan. Sounds simple, right? But compare this to European armies, where you'd have a king's troops and a duke's troops and a bishop's troops, and some knights who showed up because they felt like it, and nobody really knew who was in charge of what. European military organization was basically controlled chaos. The Mongols, they had a command structure that would make a modern army jealous. And then there's the training. Oh man, the training. See, every Mongol male was basically trained as a soldier from childhood. By age 5, you were on a horse. By age 10, you were shooting a bow while riding at full gallop. By age 15, you were ready for war. Now, I want you to picture what this actually means. Imagine you're a European knight. You've trained in armor since you were a teenager, sure. You're strong, you're brave, you can swing a sword pretty well, but you're fighting on foot or on a slow, heavy warhorse, and your training is mostly about honor and glory and individual combat. Now you're facing a Mongol warrior who's literally been on horseback since before he could walk, who can shoot arrows with deadly accuracy at full gallop, forward, backward, sideways, doesn't matter. Who can ride for 12 hours straight, switching between 3 different horses to keep them fresh? Who's trained not for individual glory but for unit cohesion, for following complex battlefield commands instantly? It's not even a fair fight. It's like putting a high school football player against an NFL team. Sure, the high school kid might be talented, might be tough, but he's just not operating at the same level. Here's a detail that really hammers this home. Mongol warriors could accurately shoot arrows while riding at full speed at targets up to 200 yards away. They could do this in any direction, even backwards, over their shoulders, while their horse was at full gallop. European knights mostly fought hand-to-hand. They'd charge, crash into the enemy line and fight it out with swords and lances. See the problem? The Mongols never had to get close. They could circle around you, shooting arrows from a safe distance, hitting you again and again while you stood there in your heavy armor, unable to catch them, unable to fight back effectively. You're like a tank being swarmed by attack helicopters. Yeah, you're tough, but you can't even engage the enemy. And here's the really clever part. This wasn't accidental. Genghis Khan had studied his enemies. He'd fought the Jin dynasty in China, which had heavily armored cavalry. He'd fought the Khwarezmian Empire in Persia, which had excellent horsemen of their own. He'd learned from every campaign, adapted, improved. By the time his grandsons are invading Europe in 1241, the Mongol military doctrine has been tested and refined through decades of continuous warfare. They know what works. They know what doesn't. They've literally written the playbook on mobile warfare. But weapons and tactics are only part of the story. What really made the Mongols unstoppable was something more subtle: their intelligence network. Before the Mongols invaded anywhere, they spent years, sometimes decades, gathering information. They sent merchants, they sent spies, they questioned refugees and prisoners. By the time they actually attacked, they knew your terrain, your politics, your military strength, your weak points. They knew which of your nobles hated each other, which cities were poorly defended, which routes had the best roads. The Mongols invaded Russia starting in 1237, but they'd been gathering intelligence on Russia since the early 1220s, 20 years of preparation. That's not a horde mindlessly invading, that's a military planning staff doing their homework. When the Mongols hit Europe in 1241, they already knew about the political divisions, the rival kingdoms, the personal feuds between leaders. They knew Hungary and Austria didn't trust each other. They knew Poland was fragmented. They exploited every single one of these weaknesses. Compare this to European intelligence, which was basically, hey, I heard there might be an army coming from the east. Or maybe it's just rumours, who knows? It's the difference between playing chess against someone who can see the whole board and plan 10 moves ahead, versus someone who's just reacting to whatever's right in front of them. Now let's talk about something that really shows the sophistication of Mongol warfare: battlefield communication. This might sound boring, but stick with me, because this is actually fascinating. On a medieval European battlefield, once the fighting started, commanders had almost no way to control their troops. Knights would charge, infantry would engage, and basically everyone just fought until one side won or ran away. There was no way to send complex commands, no way to coordinate movements, no way to adapt to changing situations in real time. The Mongols used flags, whistles, and drums to send detailed commands across the battlefield instantly. Advance, retreat, wheel left, feigned retreat, encircle. All communicated through prearranged signals that every soldier knew by heart. Picture this. You're on a hill overlooking the battle, like Mongol commanders always position themselves, and you can see the entire field. You notice the enemy's left flank is weak. You raise a flag. Within seconds, 2 of your tumens, that's 20,000 horsemen, smoothly peel off from the main engagement and sweep around to hit that weak flank. Meanwhile, your centre performs a feigned retreat to draw the enemy forward, right into the trap. That's not chaos. That's coordination. That's command and control that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the Napoleonic Wars 600 years later. And you know what the really crazy part is? The Mongols did all of this without any of the technology we take for granted. No radios, no phones, no computers, just flags and training and discipline. Now here's where Genghis Khan deserves credit. He took everything his father built and scaled it up. Genghis Khan conquered vast territories, sure, but Genghis made those conquests sustainable. He created a system of governors, established tax collection, set up trade routes, built the capital city of Karakorum with palaces and temples and workshops. He understood something crucial. You can't just conquer the world, you have to govern it. And by 1241, the Mongol Empire wasn't just a military force, it was a functioning state with bureaucracy, economy, culture, which meant they had the resources and organization to sustain long campaigns far from home. When the Mongols invaded Europe, they weren't raiders hoping to grab some loot and run. They were the advance guard of an empire that intended to stay. They were building the infrastructure for permanent conquest. Think about what that means. This wasn't a raid, this was colonization. So by 1241, when the invasion of Europe begins, the Mongols have every advantage: superior tactics, superior training, superior organization, superior intelligence, superior battlefield communication. They've conquered everyone they've ever fought. They've destroyed armies larger and more experienced than anything Europe can field. And commanding this perfect military machine is someone who understood it better than anyone alive, someone who had literally helped Genghis Khan build it from the ground up. His name is Subutai. And if you've never heard of him, well, you're about to understand why that's one of history's greatest oversights. Because Subutai wasn't just a general. He wasn't even just a great general. He was, by any objective measure, probably the most successful military commander in human history. And the campaign he's about to launch against Europe, the invasion plan he's already set in motion, is going to be his masterpiece. A 65-year-old man, too heavy to ride a horse, being carried to war in a cart. About to orchestrate a military campaign so brilliant, so devastating, that 800 years later, military academies are still studying it. You know what the wildest part is? Subutai started as nobody. No royal blood, no rich family, no connections. Just the son of a blacksmith who happened to be absolutely brilliant at warfare, and now he's about to show Europe exactly what that brilliance looks like. So let's talk about this man, this forgotten genius who conquered more territory than Alexander the Great, won more battles than Napoleon, and coordinated military operations that wouldn't be matched in complexity until World War II. Let's talk about the mind behind the machine, the strategist behind the storm, the architect of Europe's near destruction. Because understanding Subutai isn't just about understanding military history. It's about understanding how one person's genius can literally change the course of human civilization, and how sometimes the people who shape history the most are the ones we remember the least, ready to meet him. Because this is where our story gets really interesting. Picture this. It's the year 1175, somewhere on the windswept steppes of Mongolia. A baby boy is born to a blacksmith family. People so ordinary, so far from power, that history doesn't even bother recording his mother's name. This child grows up helping his father forge arrowheads and repair tools. Nothing about his birth suggests greatness. No prophecies, no divine signs, no royal bloodline. Fast forward 70 years. That same boy, now an old man so heavy he needs to be carried in a wagon, is commanding the largest military operation in human history, coordinating armies across a front that stretches from the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic. He's conquered more territory than Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and Napoleon combined. His name is Subutai, and somehow, incredibly, most people in the West have never heard of him. How does that happen? How does arguably the greatest military commander in history, someone who directed over 20 major campaigns, who never lost a significant battle, who conquered 32 nations and won 65 pitched battles, how does that person get forgotten? Well, there are a few reasons. First, he wasn't the Khan, so he didn't get the royal chronicles written about him. Second, the Mongols didn't have the same tradition of military memoirs that Europeans did. And third, and maybe most importantly for centuries, European historians simply didn't want to acknowledge that they'd been so thoroughly beaten by people they considered barbarians. But let me tell you about this man, because his story is absolutely remarkable. Subutai belonged to a clan called the Uriankai, forest people who traditionally served the Mongols as hunters and scouts. His father was a blacksmith. His older brother Yelme was already serving a minor chieftain named Temujin. You might know Temujin by his later title, Genghis Khan. When Subutai was still a teenager, probably around 14 or 15, his brother brought him to meet Temujin. And apparently even as a kid, Subutai showed something special. The story goes that Temujin looked at this blacksmith's son and said, "I see something in you. Follow me, and you'll go further than you ever imagined." Now, that might be legend, But what happened next definitely isn't. Young Subutai didn't have noble blood, didn't have wealth, didn't have connections. What he had was an absolutely brilliant tactical mind and an obsessive dedication to learning. While other warriors were content to master horsemanship and archery, Subutai studied warfare like a scholar studies texts. He learned from every battle, every campaign, every mistake. He asked questions constantly. He analyzed terrain, studied weather patterns, observed how different enemies fought. Here's what makes him truly unique. Subutai approached war like a chess grandmaster approaches chess. He didn't just think about the current battle. He thought about entire campaigns, about how one victory could set up another, about how to coordinate multiple armies across vast distances to achieve strategic objectives. And Genghis Khan recognized this. In a culture that valued battlefield courage above almost everything else, Genghis saw that Subutai's real talent wasn't swinging a sword, it was thinking 5 moves ahead. So while other commanders led from the front, charging into battle with their men, Genghis positioned Subutai where he could see the entire battlefield, where he could think, adapt, and orchestrate. Think about how radical this was. In medieval warfare, whether in Europe or Asia, leaders were expected to fight personally, to inspire their men through personal bravery. But Genghis basically told Subutai, "Your brain is too valuable. I need you thinking, not fighting." It's like having a world-class surgeon and saying, "I know everyone expects you to join the fight, but actually, I need you operating." Different kind of courage, different kind of contribution. And it worked. Oh man, did it work. Subutai's first major independent command came around 1205, when he was about 30 years old. Genghis Khan sent him with a small force to pursue an enemy tribe that had fled into the forests. Subutai tracked them for months, through terrain where Mongol cavalry supposedly couldn't operate, and brought them back as prisoners. He'd figured out how to adapt Mongol tactics to unfamiliar environments, something he'd do again and again throughout his career. But his real genius showed during the invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire starting in 1219. This was one of the most powerful empires in the world at that time, stretching across modern-day Iran, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. They had massive armies, fortified cities, and they'd foolishly insulted Genghis Khan by killing his ambassadors. Big mistake. Genghis Khan assigned Subutai and another general named Jebe to pursue the Khwarezmian Shah after the main cities fell. What followed was one of the most remarkable campaigns in military history. Subutai and Jebe led 20,000 horsemen on a chase that lasted over 2 years and covered more than 8,000 miles. Let me say that again, 8,000 miles on horseback, while fighting battles along the way. They swept through Persia, then north around the Caspian Sea, through the Caucasus Mountains, into what's now southern Russia. They defeated every army that tried to stop them. They gathered intelligence on territories Genghis Khan hadn't even planned to invade yet. And they did all of this with a force that never exceeded 20,000 men, operating thousands of miles from any support. It's like if a special forces unit went on a 2-year mission with no resupply, fought and won dozens of engagements, and came back having mapped out 3 continents worth of enemy territory. Except they did it in 1220. During this campaign, Subutai fought his first battle in Europe, the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223. A coalition of Russian princes and their Cuman allies assembled an army of about 80,000 men to stop this Mongol force that was raiding their lands. Subutai had 20,000 riders. The Russians should have won. They outnumbered the Mongols 4-1. They were fighting on their own territory. They had the support of the local population. Subutai destroyed them completely. using a tactic that would become his signature, the feigned retreat. Here's how it worked. Mongol forces would engage the enemy, fight for a bit, then suddenly turn and run. To European or Russian commanders, this looked like victory. The enemy is fleeing. Chase them down. So they'd pursue. Their formations would get stretched out, their soldiers would get tired, and just when they were most vulnerable, the retreating Mongols would wheel around, and fresh troops hidden on the flanks would attack from the sides. It's a trap as old as warfare itself, but Subutai perfected it to an art form. He could execute feigned retreats across multiple miles, over multiple hours, coordinating different units so precisely that the enemy never realized it was a trap until it was too late. At Kalka River, the Russian princes were so confident of victory that they were literally arguing about who would get credit for the win. Then Subutai sprang the trap, and within hours the Russian army ceased to exist. Contemporary chronicles say the defeat was so complete that only 1 in 10 returned home. And here's the kicker. This was just a reconnaissance mission for Subutai. He wasn't even trying to conquer Russia yet. He was just gathering information for future campaigns. After Genghis Khan died in 1227, Subutai served his son Ogedei with the same loyalty and brilliance. By now he was in his 50s, ancient by medieval standards, but his mind was sharper than ever, and when Ogedei decided to invade Europe, there was only one person who could plan and command such an ambitious operation. Subutai spent years preparing. Remember how I mentioned the Mongol intelligence network? That was largely Subutai's creation. Starting in the late 1220s, he sent merchants, spies, and refugees into Eastern Europe. They mapped roads, identified defensible positions, learned about political rivalries, assessed military capabilities. By the time the invasion began in 1236, Subutai knew more about Europe than most European kings did. His invasion plan was breathtaking in its scope and sophistication. He proposed a multi-year campaign that would systematically destroy Russia first, then use that as a base for invading Europe proper. The plan called for multiple armies operating independently, but coordinated toward a single strategic objective, something that wouldn't be attempted again until the 20th century. And at age 61, when most people of that era were long dead, Subutai personally led the Russian campaign. Between 1237 and 1240, he methodically destroyed every major Russian principality. Ryazan, Vladimir, Kozelsk, Kiev all fell to his armies. His tactics varied based on circumstances: direct assault when speed mattered, siege warfare when necessary, psychological terror to break enemy morale. One detail really shows his thoroughness. At the siege of Kiev in 1240, the Mongols deployed so many siege engines, catapults, trebuchets, battering rams, that witnesses said you could not hear a man speak because of the noise of the machines. The Mongols had learned siege warfare from Chinese engineers and applied it with devastating efficiency. But here's what truly sets Subutai apart from other great commanders: his ability to coordinate multiple armies across enormous distances with perfect timing. In early 1241, Subutai designed a campaign that still makes military historians gasp. He would split his forces into multiple columns, one heading north into Poland, others approaching Hungary from different directions, and have them converge at precise times to trap the Hungarian army. These columns would be operating hundreds of miles apart through unfamiliar territory with no modern communication. And it worked. Perfectly. Think about what this required. Subutai had to calculate how long it would take each army to reach their objectives, accounting for terrain, weather, potential resistance. He had to ensure each commander understood not just their orders, but the overall strategy. He had to build in flexibility for unexpected obstacles while maintaining overall coordination. Modern military operations with satellites, radios, and computers struggle with this level of complexity. Subutai did it with flags and fast horses. Now, remember, I mentioned that by 1241, Subutai was 65 years old and too heavy to ride. This is actually documented. Sources describe him being transported to battle in a cart or wagon because horses couldn't comfortably carry his weight anymore. Can you imagine? You're a European knight, you've trained your whole life for combat, you're in your physical prime, and you're being outmaneuvered by a 65-year-old man who literally cannot ride a horse, who's directing the battle from a cart on a hill somewhere using flag signals. That's how much his mind mattered. His body was failing, but his genius was undiminished. British military historian B.H. Liddell Hart, writing after World War I, studied Subutai's campaigns and concluded that Genghis Khan and Subutai had basically invented modern mobile warfare 700 years before anyone else. Liddell Hart used Mongol tactics as examples for how mechanized armies should operate in the 20th century. German General Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox of World War II, studied Subutai's campaigns extensively. So did George Patton. Soviet military doctrine in the 1930s explicitly drew from Mongol strategy, particularly Subutai's concept of deep penetration and encirclement. Here's something that blows my mind. In the 1930s, Soviet military theorists were studying battles that Subutai fought in the 1240s to develop tank warfare doctrine. They literally substituted tanks for horses, motorized infantry for mounted archers, and radios for flag signals, and found that Subutai's tactics still worked perfectly. 700 years later, and his strategies were still cutting edge. But in the West, crickets. For centuries, European military academies barely mentioned him. Why? Partly because studying the Mongols meant admitting that non-Europeans had achieved military sophistication that Europe wouldn't match for centuries. Partly because sources were limited and often in languages European scholars couldn't read. But mostly, I think it's because Subutai's success was too complete, too overwhelming. Europeans wanted to believe they were defeated by vast hordes, by overwhelming numbers, by barbaric savagery. The truth that they were outthought, outmaneuvered, and outfought by superior strategy and discipline, that was harder to accept. So they forgot him, this man who conquered more territory than anyone in history, who won more battles than Napoleon, who designed military campaigns that modern armies still study. They just forgot him until recently. In the past few decades, historians have started giving Subutai his due, and what they're finding is remarkable. Every time they dig deeper into Mongol campaigns, they find more evidence of Subutai's genius. So now, in early 1241, this 65-year-old master strategist, this blacksmith's son who rose through pure merit to command armies that conquered continents, is about to execute his masterpiece, the invasion of Europe, a campaign that will be studied for centuries, a campaign that will come closer to destroying Western civilization than anything before or since. And it starts with Russia, with terror, with a systematic campaign of destruction designed not just to conquer territory, but to break the will of anyone who might resist. So let's go back to those snowy Russian steppes in the late 1230s. Let's follow the storm as it gathers strength, as it prepares to sweep west, as millions of people who don't even know what's coming go about their daily lives, completely unaware that their entire world is about to be shattered. Winter, 12 to 37. The kind of cold that makes your breath freeze in the air, where rivers turn to solid ice thick enough to support an army. Most military commanders would hunker down, wait for spring, let their soldiers rest by warm fires. Not Subutai. He chose winter specifically, because frozen rivers become highways for cavalry, because defenders expect you to wait for better weather, because snow covers your movements until you're right on top of your enemy. The man turned Russia's greatest natural defense, its brutal winter, into a weapon against itself. And on a December morning in 1237, approximately 130,000 Mongol horsemen crossed the frozen Volga River and entered the Russian principalities. What followed over the next 3 years wasn't just a military campaign. It was systematic annihilation, a masterclass in how to break not just armies, but entire civilizations. Let me take you through what actually happened, because the details matter. This isn't just about battles won and cities captured. This is about how terror, when strategically applied, becomes more powerful than any army. The first major city in Subutai's path was Ryazan. Now Ryazan wasn't a huge city by European standards, maybe 30,000 people, but it was wealthy, it was fortified, and its prince, Yuri Igorovich, was known as a capable military leader. When Mongol envoys arrived demanding submission and tribute, 1/10 of everything the city owned, Prince Yuri sent back a message that would have sounded brave if it wasn't so tragic. Only when none of us remain, then all will be yours. Subutai took him at his word. The Mongol army surrounded Ryazan in December 1237. The city had stone walls, experienced defenders, and enough supplies to last months. Under normal siege conditions, they might have held out. But these weren't normal conditions. The Mongols had brought Chinese siege engineers. These engineers had catapults, trebuchets, and something the Russians had never seen before: primitive rockets and gunpowder bombs. Not the sophisticated explosives we think of today, but crude devices that created tremendous noise, smoke, and fire. Imagine you're a defender on the walls. You've never heard an explosion in your life, and suddenly these screaming, fiery objects are flying over the walls, detonating with sounds like thunder, spreading flames everywhere. The psychological impact was devastating. Some defenders thought it was sorcery, others that the Mongols had harnessed demonic powers. The actual military effect was significant too. Walls cracked, wooden structures burned, defenders couldn't hold their positions. After 5 days, just 5 days, Ryazan's walls were breached. And here's where things get dark, really dark. When Mongol forces took a city that had resisted, they didn't just loot it. They made an example of it. The Russian chronicles describe what happened next in terms that are hard to read even 800 years later. Every person in Ryazan was killed. Men, women, children, elderly, priests, everyone. The city was then burned so thoroughly that, according to one chronicle, no eye remained open to weep for the dead. Prince Yuri's wife and daughters were killed in front of him before he was executed. The entire ruling family was wiped out. Now, why am I telling you these horrible details? Not for shock value, but because this was strategic. Subutai understood something that modern militaries call information operations. Every survivor who fled Ryazan, every merchant who heard the story, every prince in neighboring cities, they all learned the same lesson. Resist the Mongols, and your city dies. Not just defeated, erased. And it worked. It worked terrifyingly well. News of Ryazan's fate spread across Russia faster than the Mongol army could ride. The next city in Subutai's path was Kolomna, where Prince Yuri's brother had assembled an army to stop the invasion. They fought hard. Chronicles mention the battle was fierce, and that Mongol casualties were significant, including one of Genghis Khan's sons, who was killed in the fighting. But the Russians were still fighting in their traditional way. Meet the enemy, form a line, fight it out hand to hand. The Mongols would feign retreat, the Russians would pursue, and then Mongol cavalry would sweep in from the flanks. Same trap, different city. Kolomna's army was destroyed in a single afternoon. Here's something that really shows Subbutai's thoroughness. After major battles, the Mongols would count their casualties and their enemies' casualties by cutting off one ear from each corpse. They'd fill bags with ears and bring them back for accounting. This wasn't savagery for its own sake, it was logistics. Subbutai needed accurate casualty reports to plan future operations. He was treating warfare like a science, collecting data, measuring results. Can you imagine being a Russian survivor, seeing Mongol soldiers with bags full of human ears, knowing each one represents someone who died? The psychological warfare is almost as effective as the actual fighting. By February 1238, the Mongols reached Vladimir, the most powerful of the Russian principalities. Grand Prince Yuri Theka had assembled what he thought was a formidable army. Contemporary sources suggest around 50,000 men, and positioned them to defend the capital. The Mongols split into multiple columns, attacked simultaneously from different directions, and crushed the Russian army before most of the soldiers even understood what was happening. The battle was over so quickly that chroniclers struggled to describe it. One wrote simply, "The Mongols came, and it was as if a storm wind had passed, leaving only death." Vladimir itself fell after a short siege. The Grand Prince's family took refuge in a cathedral, hoping the Mongols would respect the sanctity of a holy place. They didn't. The cathedral was burned with everyone inside. Grand Prince Yuri himself wasn't even in Vladimir when it fell. He'd gone north to raise more troops. When he heard his capital had fallen and his family was dead, he gathered the remaining Russian princes and their armies for one last stand. They met the Mongols on March 4th, 1238, at the Battle of the Sit River. It wasn't even close. The Russians were exhausted, demoralized, still fighting with outdated tactics against an enemy who'd spent decades perfecting mobile warfare. The Grand Prince was killed, along with most of the Russian nobility. In 3 months, the Mongols had effectively destroyed the military power of all the Russian principalities. 3 months. That's faster than most modern military operations, and they did it in winter, in hostile territory against an enemy defending their homeland. But here's what really shows Subbutai's strategic mind. He didn't try to occupy all of Russia immediately. That would have overstretched his forces. Instead, he destroyed military resistance, installed puppet rulers in some cities, left others in ruins as warnings, and moved on. He was creating a buffer zone, a conquered territory that would serve as a staging ground for the next phase, invading Europe proper. Now, while all this destruction is happening, something else is going on that will have huge consequences for Europe. Remember those Cumans I mentioned earlier, the nomadic people who were traditional rivals of the Rus? About 40,000 Cumans, entire tribes with their families, herds, everything they owned, were fleeing westward from the Mongol advance. Their Khan, a man named Kotoni, sometimes called Kuthan, led them through Poland and into Hungary in late 1239. They were desperate, traumatized refugees who'd seen what the Mongols did to those who resisted. King Bellathor of Hungary faced a difficult choice. These were 40,000 people, including maybe 10,000 experienced horsemen, who needed refuge. They were pagans, they were nomads, they had a reputation for raiding. Many of Bella's nobles opposed taking them in, but Bela was a strategic thinker. He saw experienced cavalry who could help defend Hungary. He saw people who understood how the Mongols fought. so he granted them asylum on the condition that they convert to Christianity. The Cumans agreed. Cottoni and his people were baptized in a mass ceremony. They settled in the eastern regions of Hungary, and for a while, it seemed like a win-win situation. Hungary got reinforcements, the Cumans got safety. Except Batu Khan, the overall Mongol commander in the west, didn't see it that way. To him, the Cumans were rebellious subjects, and Hungary was harbouring fugitives. And in Mongol diplomatic language, that's an act of war. So by late 1240, Hungary had unknowingly painted a target on itself. The Mongols now had a justification for invasion. Not that they really needed one, but having a casus belli made it easier to present to their own nobility and to other kingdoms they might want to negotiate with later. Meanwhile, Subutais' attention turned to Kiev. If Vladimir was the political heart of Russia, Kiev was its spiritual soul, the mother city, the place where Russian Christianity began, one of the great cities of Eastern Europe. In 1240, Kiev had a population somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 people, massive stone walls, and a fierce determination not to share Ryazan's or Vladimir's fate. The siege of Kiev began in November 1240 and lasted for about 2 months. This is where we see the full arsenal of Mongol siege warfare. They had dozens of catapults and trebuchets constantly bombarding the walls. They had siege towers rolling up to the battlements. They had engineers tunneling under the walls to collapse them. And they had those gunpowder weapons creating constant noise and terror. A contemporary chronicler wrote that the sound of the Mongol siege engines was so loud that one could not hear the words of another person, even shouting. The defenders held out bravely. When one section of wall fell, they'd retreat to another defensive line and keep fighting. When the outer walls were breached, they fortified the churches and kept fighting from there. But they were doomed. The Mongols just had too many advantages: better siege technology, more soldiers, fresh troops to rotate in while defenders grew exhausted. By December 6, 1240, Kiev fell. And here's a detail that really captures the scale of destruction. Kiev was one of the largest cities in Europe at that time, comparable to Paris or Constantinople. After the Mongols left, it was barely a village. One visitor 6 years later wrote that he could only count about 200 houses standing. The population had been reduced to maybe 2,000 people. A city of 50,000 to 100,000 reduced to 2,000 in a matter of weeks. That's not just military conquest, that's demographic catastrophe. Now, while Kiev was being destroyed, something interesting was happening in Western Europe. Rumors of the Mongol invasion were starting to filter through. Merchants brought stories. Refugees appeared with tales of cities burning and armies vanishing. But Western European leaders, kings, dukes, the Pope, they didn't really believe it. Part of the problem was distance. Kiev might as well have been on another planet as far as Paris or London were concerned. Part of it was prejudice. The Russians were Orthodox Christians, not Catholic, so Western Europeans didn't feel particularly obligated to help them. And part of it was just inability to comprehend the scale of what was happening. When reports came that the Mongols had conquered all of Russia in 3 years, Western European leaders thought, that's obviously an exaggeration. Nobody can move that fast, conquer that much territory. They assumed it was hyperbole, the kind of inflated stories that always emerge during wartime. They were wrong. If anything, the reports understated how bad it was. By early 1241, Subutais' 3-year campaign through Russia was complete. He'd destroyed every major principality, killed most of the ruling nobility, devastated the population, and created a zone of absolute Mongol control stretching from the Volga River to the Carpathian Mountains. and he'd done it with relatively modest casualties, maybe 15,000 to 20,000 Mongol soldiers lost out of an army of 130,000. That's a casualty rate that any modern military would consider remarkably low for such extensive operations. Russia would remain under Mongol control, what historians call the Mongol yoke, for the next 240 years. That's longer than the United States has existed as a country. Think about that impact. An entire civilization, one of the great powers of Eastern Europe, subjugated for 2.5 centuries because of a 3-year military campaign. And now, in the spring of 1241, Subutai had his staging ground. He had veteran troops who just conquered Russia. He had intelligence on European defenses. He had supply lines established. He had the psychological momentum. Every kingdom west of Russia knew what the Mongols had done, and that knowledge bred fear. All the pieces were in place for the next phase, the invasion of Europe proper. Subutai's plan was elegant and terrifying. He would split his forces into multiple columns, attacking Poland and Hungary simultaneously. The northern column would destroy Polish resistance and prevent any relief forces from coming south. The main army would invade Hungary from multiple directions, trap the Hungarian army, and destroy it in a single decisive battle. Then, with Poland and Hungary subdued, the road to Western Europe would be wide open. Germany, Austria, Italy, France. None of them had armies capable of stopping what was coming. None of them had even begun to prepare. And here's the beautiful, terrible genius of it. The Polish and Hungarian campaigns would happen at almost exactly the same time, coordinated across hundreds of miles of territory, timed so precisely that 2 major battles would occur within 48 hours of each other. In an era before telegraphs, before radios, before any modern communication, Subutai was about to conduct a military operation of a sophistication that wouldn't be matched until World War II. So as winter turned to spring in 1241, 2 storms were gathering. In the north, a Mongol army under Princes Baida and Kadan was preparing to sweep through Poland. In the south, the main force under Batu Khan and Subutai himself was positioning to invade Hungary. Europe had been warned. Refugees had brought stories. Merchants had spread rumors. The Pope had even sent ambassadors to investigate the threat. But warnings don't stop arrows. Fear doesn't block cavalry charges, and good intentions don't win battles. The storm that had destroyed Russia was about to hit Christian Europe with full force. And in just a few short weeks, in early April 1241, 2 battles would take place that would determine whether Western civilization survived or whether the Mongols would ride all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Let me tell you about those battles, about the desperate stands, the tactical genius, the moments of courage and terror that would decide the fate of a continent. Because April 1241 is when everything comes to a head, when all of Subutai's planning meets the last organized resistance Europe can offer, and what happens next will shock you. There's a moment in every great military campaign where everything hinges on the plan. Not the fighting, that comes later. Not the courage, that's always present. But the plan, the grand strategy that either sets you up for victory or dooms you to failure before the first arrow is even fired. In early 1241, Subutai sat down, probably literally given his age and weight, and designed what might be the most ambitious coordinated military operation in pre-modern history. And when I say ambitious, I mean the kind of plan that would make Napoleon pace nervously, that would make Eisenhower planning D-Day nod in respect. Let me walk you through it, because understanding this plan is understanding genius itself. Subutai had a problem. Actually, he had several problems. He needed to invade Europe, but Europe was big, diverse, and theoretically capable of fielding massive armies if they ever got organized. Hungary alone could potentially raise 80,000 to 100,000 soldiers. Poland, if unified, might manage similar numbers. If these forces combined with German, Austrian and Bohemian armies, the Mongols could face a coalition of 300,000 to 400,000 men. Now, the Mongol army in Europe totaled about 150,000 horsemen. Not a small force by any means, but not enough to simply overwhelm united European resistance through sheer numbers. Plus, Subutai couldn't commit all his forces to one front because he still needed to maintain control over the vast Russian territories he'd just conquered. So what did he do? He turned Europe's greatest potential strength, its size and diversity, into its greatest weakness. He designed a plan so sophisticated that it wouldn't be matched in complexity until the age of radio communication. Here's the core concept: divide and conquer, but with surgical precision. Subutai split his forces into 5 separate armies. Yes, 5, each with specific objectives, each operating hundreds of miles apart from the others, but all coordinated toward a single strategic goal. 3 of these armies would invade Hungary from different directions. One would attack Poland from the north, and one would strike through Transylvania from the southeast. Think about what this requires for a moment. You're coordinating 5 separate military operations across a front that stretches from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. We're talking about 800 miles, maybe more. These armies need to move at different speeds through different terrain, arrive at their objectives at specific times, and do all of this without any modern communication technology. How do you even begin to plan something like that? Well, first, you need intelligence. Detailed, accurate intelligence. And remember those merchants and spies Subutai had been sending into Europe for years? This is where that investment pays off. By 1241, Subutai knew more about European roads, bridges, mountain passes and city defences than most European kings did. He knew which routes could support large cavalry movements. He knew where rivers could be forded and when they'd be frozen or swollen with spring melt. He knew the political situation in every major kingdom, who was allied with whom, who hated whom, who could potentially come to whose aid. This wasn't guesswork. This was data-driven military planning in the 13th century. Second, you need mathematics. Subutai calculated how long it would take each army to reach their objectives based on distance, terrain, and expected resistance. He built in buffers for unexpected delays. He designated fallback positions if things went wrong. He was essentially creating a military timetable that would have impressed a German railway scheduler. And third, this is crucial, you need subordinate commanders who understand not just their orders, but the overall strategic objective. Because things will go wrong. Weather will be worse than expected. Enemy resistance will be stronger in some places, weaker in others. Your commanders need to be able to adapt while still working toward the common goal. The Mongol officer corps was perfect for this. Remember that meritocracy we talked about? Every two-man commander had risen through the ranks based on proven ability. They'd trained together, fought together, and developed a shared understanding of Mongol tactics. When Subutai gave them orders, he didn't need to micromanage. They knew what needed to be done. Compare this to European armies, where nobles commanded based on birth, where different contingents often spoke different languages, where there was no unified training or doctrine. European commanders couldn't coordinate like this even if they wanted to. So here's how Subutai's plan unfolded. Pay attention because the elegance of this is just beautiful. The northern force, about 20,000 cavalry under Princes Baida and Khaden, would invade Poland in late 1240, moving through multiple duchies, burning cities, destroying armies. Their objective wasn't to conquer Poland permanently. It was to create chaos, prevent Polish forces from marching south to help Hungary, and ideally draw German and Bohemian armies north away from Hungary. They were a diversion. A 20,000-man diversion that would destroy multiple armies and terrify half of Europe. But strategically, they were just the feint before the real punch. The main invasion force, about 80,000 to 90,000 horsemen under Batu Khan and Subutai, would split into 3 columns and invade Hungary simultaneously from 3 directions. One column would come from the north, through the Carpathian passes. Another would approach from the northeast, through Transylvania. The third would swing around from the southeast through Moldavia and Wallachia. Now here's where it gets really clever. These 3 columns would enter Hungary days apart, from different directions, giving the impression of multiple separate invasions. King Bela IV of Hungary would have to split his forces to meet these threats, or choose which invasion to respond to while leaving other borders vulnerable. And once the Hungarian army committed to facing one of these columns, the others would wheel around and converge, trapping the Hungarians in a perfect encirclement. It's like a chess grandmaster playing 5 boards simultaneously, and on each board, the opponent thinks they're playing a different game, not realizing all 5 games are connected and leading to the same inevitable checkmate. The timing was everything. Subutai calculated that the northern diversion in Poland would reach its climax in early April. That's when Polish forces, possibly reinforced by Germans and Bohemians, would finally assemble a large enough army to face the Mongols. The Mongols would defeat this army. Subutai was confident of that, and the news of this defeat would demoralize any potential relief forces that might think about marching to Hungary's aid. Meanwhile, in Hungary, the 3 Mongol columns would converge in mid-April, catch the Hungarian army, and destroy it in a single decisive battle. 2 major battles, separated by about 400 miles, happening within 48 hours of each other, both planned months in advance, both essential to the overall strategy. Have you ever tried to coordinate plans with just 2 or 3 friends? Getting everyone to show up at the same restaurant at the same time can be a challenge, right? Now imagine coordinating 5 armies across 800 miles of medieval Europe, with no phones, no radios, just fast horses and prearranged signals. That's what Subutai pulled off. But wait, there's more. Because Subutai didn't just plan the invasions, he planned the logistics. And in warfare, logistics is often more important than tactics. The Mongol army travelled with enormous herds of horses. Each warrior had multiple mounts, usually 3 to 5. This meant they could ride hard, switch to a fresh horse, and keep going while European pursuers' horses wore out. But it also meant they needed pasture land. Lots of it. Subutai timed the invasion for early spring specifically because that's when grass would be growing in the Hungarian plain. Hungary's vast grasslands could support the Mongol herds in a way that more forested Western European terrain couldn't. He wasn't just planning to conquer Hungary, he was planning to use Hungary as a forward base for pushing further west. He also planned supply lines back through conquered Russian territory, relay stations for messages, supply depots for arrows and equipment, even field hospitals for wounded soldiers. This wasn't a raid. This was a military operation with infrastructure. And the psychological dimension? That was planned too. Subutai knew that every city that fell, every army that was destroyed, would create a wave of refugees fleeing westward, spreading panic, clogging roads, making it harder for European kingdoms to organize effective resistance. Terror wasn't a side effect of the invasion. It was a weapon deliberately employed. There's a chilling efficiency to it, like watching a machine work, where every gear turns at exactly the right moment, where every component serves its purpose. Except the components are human lives, the machine is war, and the result is the potential end of European civilization as it existed. Now, I want you to understand something important about why this plan was so revolutionary. Military historians, the really serious ones who spend their careers studying warfare, they rank Subbutai's 1241 campaign as one of the most sophisticated operations ever conducted. Not just for its time, but compared to any military operation in history. Why? Because Subbutai was doing something that wouldn't be attempted again until World War I and II, coordinating multiple independent forces across vast distances toward a strategic objective that required precise timing. During World War II, the Allies had to coordinate D-Day, landing forces on multiple beaches, paratroopers inland, naval bombardment, air support, all timed to the hour. And they had radio, radar, telephones, cryptography machines, weather forecasting. They spent 2 years planning it, and it almost fell apart several times. Subbutai planned something arguably more complex with none of those technologies, and it worked almost perfectly. The Soviet military theorists I mentioned earlier, the ones developing deep battle doctrine in the 1930s, they studied Subbutai's 1241 campaign specifically for this reason. They were trying to figure out how to coordinate multiple mechanized armies across a broad front, and they found their template in a 700-year-old Mongol invasion. That should tell you something about the level of sophistication we're dealing with. But here's what really gets me about this plan. Subbutai was 65 years old when he designed it. In an era when most people were lucky to live to 50, when military commanders were usually in their 30s or 40s, this elderly general, who couldn't even ride a horse anymore, was outthinking everyone by centuries. There's something poetic about that, don't you think? All these young, vigorous European knights in their prime, and they're about to be completely outmaneuvered by an old man in a cart who sees the battlefield as a chessboard. Now, as this plan begins to unfold in late 1240 and early 1241, European leaders are finally starting to realize something terrible is coming. But they don't understand what. They're getting reports of Mongol forces in multiple places, moving in different directions, and it doesn't make sense. Is it one invasion or several? Are these different armies or the same one moving impossibly fast? King Bela IV of Hungary is getting particularly worried. He's hearing about the destruction of Russia. He knows the Cumans fled to his kingdom for protection. He's smart enough to understand that the Mongols might come for him next. So he sends out calls for help to neighbouring kingdoms. And here's where European disunity becomes fatal. Austria, which should be Hungary's natural ally, doesn't respond. They're having disputes with Bela over territory. Germany is too politically fragmented to coordinate a response. The Pope calls for a crusade against the Mongols, but nobody takes it seriously because they're too busy with their own problems. Poland is slightly better positioned. At least some of the Polish princes are talking to each other. Duke Henry II of Silesia manages to assemble a coalition force including Poles, Germans and knights from military orders like the Templars and Hospitallers. He's gathering troops at Legnica, preparing to face the Mongol northern force. But even this army is a coalition of rivals who barely trust each other. The Poles and Germans have to negotiate through interpreters. The military orders answer to the Pope, not to Henry. Nobody's quite sure who's actually in command. It's an army assembled by committee, which is about as effective as it sounds. Meanwhile, Henry receives a message from King Wenceslas II of Bohemia, who's marching north with an army of about 50,000 men. If Wenceslas can link up with Henry's forces, probably another 25,000 to 30,000, they'd have a combined force of 75,000 to 80,000 soldiers. That's actually substantial enough to potentially stop the Mongol northern column. Wenceslas sends word, "Wait for me. "I'll be there in 2 days. Don't engage until we combine forces." It's good advice. Exactly what a sensible commander would do, but Subutai has already anticipated this. His spies have told him about both armies, about their planned rendezvous, and the whole point of the northern diversion is to prevent European forces from concentrating. If Henry and Wenceslas combine, if they actually work together effectively, they might cause real problems. So the Mongol northern column under Baydar and Kardon does something bold. They march directly toward Henry's army at Legnica, forcing him to fight before Wenceslas arrives. It's a calculated risk. They'll be outnumbered, at least slightly, but the Mongols are betting that their superior tactics will overcome the numbers disadvantage. And they're right. Which brings us to early April 1241. The northern column has ravaged Poland, burning cities, destroying smaller armies, creating absolute chaos. Now they're approaching Legnica, where Duke Henry II has assembled the last significant Polish army and is desperately hoping Wenceslas will arrive in time. In Hungary, King Bela is mobilizing his forces, trying to figure out how to respond to reports of Mongol armies approaching from 3 different directions. He's got maybe 80,000 to 100,000 men under arms, the largest army Hungary has ever assembled. But he can't be everywhere at once. Both theatres are set. Both sides are moving toward their fateful confrontations. And Subutai's plan is unfolding exactly as designed. In Poland, on April 9th, 1241, Duke Henry II will lead his army out to meet the Mongols at a place called Legnicki Pole, the field of Legnica. He'll be hoping that European armour, European courage, and the blessing of God will be enough to stop these eastern invaders. It won't be. And 2 days later, on April 11th, King Bela IV will face the main Mongol army at a place called Mohi, near the Sajo River in Hungary. It will be one of the most devastating battles in European history. But before we get to those battles, before we talk about what actually happened on those bloody fields, I need you to understand what was at stake. These weren't just military engagements. These were existential struggles. If both these battles went to the Mongols, and Subutai had planned for exactly that, then there would be no organized military force capable of stopping a Mongol advance into Western Europe. Germany, Austria, Italy, France, none of them would be ready. None of them would be able to assemble armies fast enough. The Mongols would have a clear road all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. So as we move into April 1241, as Duke Henry leads his men toward Legnica, as King Bela positions his army near the Sajo River, the fate of Western civilization is genuinely hanging in the balance. And most people in Europe don't even know it yet. They're about to learn, in the hardest way possible. Dawn breaks on April 9, 1241, near the town of Legnica in Silesia. If you're Duke Henry II, known to history as Henry the Pious, you've barely slept. You spent the night praying in your tent, asking God for victory, for strength, for a miracle. Around you, 25,000 to 30,000 men are preparing for battle. Polish knights, German mercenaries, Templar and Hospitaller brothers, Teutonic knights sent by the Pope himself. It should feel reassuring, commanding such a force. These are professional warriors, many of them veterans. You've got heavy cavalry that's crushed enemies before. You've got the blessing of the church. You're fighting to defend your home, your people, your faith. But you can't shake this feeling of dread. Maybe it was the omen. As Henry rode through Legnica the day before, a stone fell from the roof of St. Mary's Church and nearly killed him. Just missed his head by inches. The people saw it. They whispered, "Bad luck, a sign from God. Death is coming." Or maybe it's the reports from scouts. The Mongols aren't acting like any enemy Henry has faced before. They're not forming up for a traditional battle. They're spreading out, circling, moving in patterns that don't make tactical sense. unless you understand what they're actually doing, which Henry doesn't. What Henry does know is this: King Wenceslas and his 50,000 Bohemians are still 2 days away. If he waits, he'll have overwhelming numerical superiority. But if he waits, the Mongols might slip away, or worse, ravage more of his territory while he does nothing. It's a commander's nightmare. Wait and be called a coward, or fight and risk everything on uncertain odds. Henry chooses to fight. Here's what Henry doesn't know. This isn't a choice he's making freely. The Mongols under Baydar and Khadan have positioned themselves specifically to force this battle now, before reinforcements arrive. They've been maneuvering for days to create exactly this situation. Henry thinks he's making a command decision. Really, he's doing exactly what Subutai planned for him to do. It's like playing poker against someone who's already seen your cards. The Mongol force facing Henry numbers somewhere between 8,000 and 20,000 cavalry. Sources disagree on the exact count, but it's definitely smaller than Henry's army. Modern historians lean toward the lower estimate, maybe 10,000 horsemen, which would have been reduced to around 8,000 after losses from earlier battles at Schmielnik and Tursko. So Henry has the numbers. 3-1 advantage, maybe better. In traditional European warfare, that should be decisive. Line up your heavy cavalry, charge, crash into the enemy, and let superior numbers and armour win the day. The Mongols aren't planning to fight a traditional European battle. As dawn light spreads across the field near Legnicki Pole, which literally means field of Legnica, both armies begin to deploy. Henry arranges his forces in the European style, heavy cavalry in the centre, lighter cavalry and infantry on the flanks, with the military order knights, the Templars, Hospitallers, Teutons, forming a reserve that can reinforce wherever needed. It's a solid formation. Textbook medieval tactics. Any European commander would approve. The Mongols spread out into their typical formation, light cavalry in the centre, heavy cavalry on the wings and in reserve. But here's the thing. Their formation keeps moving, shifting, never quite settling into a fixed position. It's unsettling to watch, like trying to pin down smoke. The battle begins with the Mongol light cavalry advancing toward the European centre. They're within bow range now, maybe 200 yards out, and they start shooting. Arrows arc through the morning sky, thousands of them, a constant rain of death. Henry's knights are in full armour, chainmail, plate in some cases, shields, helmets. The arrows shouldn't be a major threat, and they're not, individually. But they don't stop. Wave after wave, thousands of arrows never letting up. Some find gaps in armour, visors, joints, anywhere the metal doesn't quite cover. Knights start falling, not many, but enough to be concerning. And the psychological effect is worse than the casualties. Have you ever been in a situation where you can't fight back? Where you just have to endure punishment and wait? It's infuriating. It's demoralizing. That's what Henry's knights are experiencing. They want to charge, to close the distance, to fight with sword and lance like they're trained to do. But their commanders hold them back, waiting for the right moment. The Mongol cavalry, still shooting, starts to retreat. Slowly at first, then faster. They're turning and running. It looks like they're breaking, fleeing from the superior European force. This is it. This is the moment. Henry's commanders see the enemy retreating and they make the call. Charge! Run them down! The heavy cavalry surges forward. Hundreds of armoured knights on massive war horses thundering across the field. The ground shakes. It's a glorious sight. The flower of European chivalry in full charge, pursuing a beaten enemy. Except the enemy isn't beaten. They're executing the oldest trick in the Mongol playbook, the feigned retreat. As the European cavalry charges forward, they're doing exactly what exhausted horses do. They're extending their line, spreading out as faster horses pull ahead and slower ones fall behind. The tight formation that made them strong starts to fracture. Knights are getting separated from their supporting infantry. The careful battle plan is falling apart in the excitement of pursuit. And then the Mongols do something Henry's forces have never seen before. They create a smoke screen. Contemporary sources describe the Mongols releasing some kind of smoke or fog that obscured the battlefield. Modern historians debate what exactly this was. Some think it was burning tar or pitch. Others suggest it might have been an early form of gunpowder weapon, possibly similar to the fire lance devices used in China. Whatever it was, it created thick, acrid smoke that rolled across the field, separating the charging knights from their supporting forces. Imagine you're a knight in full armor, you're chasing the enemy, your blood is up, and suddenly you can't see anything. Just smoke, confusion, the sounds of horses and men all around you, but no visual reference. You can't see your commander, can't see your fellow knights, can't even tell which direction the enemy went. It's terrifying, and it's about to get much worse. While the European cavalry is confused and separated in the smoke, the Mongol light cavalry that was retreating wheels around. The heavy cavalry that was hidden on the flanks closes in from the sides, and suddenly, the European knights aren't pursuing a defeated enemy. They're surrounded by fresh troops attacking from multiple directions. This is what military historians call an encirclement, or double envelopment. It's one of the hardest maneuvers to pull off in warfare, requiring precise coordination and timing. The Romans occasionally managed it. Hannibal pulled it off at Cannae. It's brutally effective when it works. The Mongols made it look easy. Knights in full armor are incredibly difficult to kill in one-on-one combat. Their armor can deflect most sword strikes, most arrows. But when you're surrounded, when you're taking arrows from multiple directions, when you can't maneuver because there are enemies on all sides, that armor becomes a liability. It's heavy, it's hot, you're exhausted, and the Mongols aren't trying to fight you one-on-one. They're shooting from a distance, targeting your horse, targeting the gaps in your armor, wearing you down. It's not a battle at this point, it's a slaughter. The center of Henry's army collapses within an hour. Knights are pulled from their horses. Those who try to flee on foot are run down by Mongol cavalry. The supporting infantry, seeing the cream of their army destroyed, begins to panic and rout. Duke Henry himself tries to flee. He's fighting through the chaos, trying to reach safety, maybe gather reinforcements, maybe just survive. He almost makes it. But Mongol cavalry catch him, kill him, and cut off his head. Then, and this is a detail that really captures the psychological warfare aspect, the Mongols parade Henry's head around the city of Legnica on the end of a spear. They want everyone to see. They want the message to be clear. This is what happens when you fight us. Your duke, your leader, your symbol of authority, dead, displayed like a trophy. And remember that custom I mentioned earlier about collecting ears? After the Battle of Legnica, the Mongols filled 9 sacks with ears cut from the dead. 9 sacks. Contemporary sources specifically mention this detail because it was so shocking, so methodical, so deliberately horrifying. Think about what that means. Someone had to go through the battlefield methodically cutting one ear from each corpse, collecting them, counting them. It's record-keeping, it's logistics. But it's also a message. We are so confident, so systematic, that we treat your dead as inventory. The casualty figures tell the story. Henry's army of 25,000 to 30,000 was essentially destroyed. Maybe 2,000 to 3,000 escaped. The Mongol losses, probably a few hundred at most. It wasn't even close. But here's what makes this battle truly significant. It was a diversion. Remember, this entire campaign in Poland, these 20,000 Mongol cavalry, all the cities burned, all the armies destroyed, it was all just to prevent Polish forces from marching south to help Hungary. Imagine being told you're the diversion, the secondary objective, and then you go out and destroy the combined armies of Poland and Germany, kill one of the most powerful dukes in Central Europe, and create panic across half the continent. That's how overwhelmingly superior the Mongols were. King Wenceslas of Bohemia, who was rushing to reinforce Henry, heard the news of the disaster at Legnica and immediately turned around. He'd been 2 days away from the battlefield. 2 days. If Henry had waited, if they'd combined forces, would the outcome have been different? Probably not. The Mongols would have just adjusted their tactics, maybe avoided direct battle, maybe broken off and struck elsewhere. But we'll never know, because Henry made the choice to fight, and that choice doomed not just his army, but potentially all of Central Europe. After Legnica, a small Mongol force pursued Wenceslas into Bohemia, but the Bohemian cavalry managed to ambush and drive them off near Klodsko. It's one of the few tactical successes Europeans achieved against the Mongols during this entire campaign. But it didn't matter strategically. The main Mongol force had already achieved its objective. Polish and German forces were scattered, demoralized, and in no position to help anyone. The road to Hungary was clear, and here's something that should send chills down your spine. While the Battle of Legnica was happening on April 9th, Subotai was already positioning his forces in Hungary for the main event. The coordination, the timing, the execution of a plan that required 2 major battles to happen within 48 hours of each other, hundreds of miles apart. It was all working perfectly. The news of Legnica's disaster spread through Europe faster than any army could march. Refugees, merchants, survivors, they brought stories of invincible horsemen, of European chivalry crushed like insects, of a duke's head paraded on a spear. Panic spread from Poland to Germany to Austria, and in Vienna, in Prague, in Venice. European leaders started asking themselves the same question. If the combined might of Poland and Germany couldn't stop these invaders, what chance do we have? Pope Gregory XI, who'd sent those military orders to help Henry, who'd been calling for crusades against the Mongols, received the news in Rome. Some sources suggest he actually suffered a stroke from the shock, though he was already elderly and in poor health. Whether the news directly caused his death weeks later is debatable, but it certainly didn't help. The Pope dying, Poland destroyed, Germany in panic, Bohemia retreating. This is what happens when your entire defensive strategy collapses in a single afternoon. But remember, this was just Act 1. The real drama, the main event, was about to unfold in Hungary. Because 2 days after Legnica, on April 11th, 1241, King Bela IV of Hungary would face the full might of the Mongol Empire at a place called Mohi. And that battle would make Legnica look like a warm-up. Bela had assembled the largest army Hungary had ever fielded, somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 men. He had the advantage of defending his homeland. He had fortified positions. He had, on paper, everything he needed to stop the Mongols. What he didn't have was any understanding of what was coming for him, because Subotai had spent months, years, really, preparing for this exact battle, and the trap he'd set for the Hungarian army was so perfectly executed, so brutally efficient, that military academies still study it today as an example of battlefield excellence. So let's head south from the killing fields of Legnica. Let's follow the roads to Hungary, where an even greater tragedy is about to unfold. where a king will watch his kingdom die in a single day, where Subutai will demonstrate why he's remembered, when he's remembered at all, as perhaps the greatest tactical commander in human history. Because if Legnica was shocking, if Legnica was devastating, Moe was going to be apocalyptic. While Duke Henry's severed head is being paraded through the streets of Legnica, King Bela IV of Hungary is facing what might be the worst week of his life. And that's saying something, because his life up to this point hasn't exactly been easy. Bela is 35 years old, and he's been dealing with problems since the moment he took the throne 7 years earlier. His father left him a kingdom drowning in debt. His nobles constantly challenge his authority. The Pope is mad at him for various political reasons. His neighbour, Duke Frederick II of Austria, keeps raiding Hungarian territory, and is generally being what we'd politely call a difficult person. But all of those problems, they're about to seem trivial. It's early April 1241, and Bela is receiving reports that make no sense. Mongol armies are approaching Hungary from 3 different directions, one from the north, through the Carpathian passes, another from the northeast through Transylvania, a third from the southeast, coming up through Moldavia and Wallachia. Now, Bela isn't stupid. He's actually quite intelligent, well-educated, speaks multiple languages. He understands that these must be coordinated attacks, but the scale of coordination required, the idea that someone planned this months in advance, that these armies are moving in sync across hundreds of miles, that's almost impossible to comprehend. It's like if someone told you that 3 separate hurricanes were going to hit your city from different directions at exactly the same time. Your brain knows that's not how weather works, but here it is, happening anyway. Bela has been preparing for this moment ever since he gave asylum to the Cumans. He's been building up his military, stockpiling supplies, strengthening fortifications. Hungary, under his rule, has assembled the largest army in its history. Contemporary sources suggest somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 men. To put that in perspective, that's larger than most European kingdoms could field. That's a genuinely impressive force. Hungary at this time is one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe, with excellent cavalry, experienced commanders, and the advantage of defending their own territory. On paper, Bela should be able to win this fight, but there's a problem. Actually, there are several problems, and they're all about to come crashing down on Bela's head at the worst possible moment. Problem number 1, the Cumans. Remember those 40,000 Cuman refugees that Bela took in? The ones he let convert to Christianity, the ones he thought would help defend Hungary? Well, most Hungarians never liked having them around. These were nomadic people with different customs, different language, different everything. And now that the Mongols are invading, specifically because Hungary gave them refuge, a lot of Hungarians are starting to think the Cumans are more trouble than they're worth. Worse, rumours start spreading. Poisonous, paranoid rumours. The Cumans are actually Mongol spies. They're going to betray us during the battle. They're secretly in league with the enemy. None of this is true. The Cumans hate the Mongols, that's why they fled in the first place. But fear makes people believe stupid things. And on one particularly terrible night, a mob of Hungarian nobles and their followers attack the Cuman camp. They kill Khan Kotoni, the Cuman leader who'd converted to Christianity and sworn loyalty to Bela. They kill his family. They kill other Cuman leaders. It's a massacre based on paranoia and xenophobia. The surviving Cumans, we're talking about 35,000 to 40,000 people who are supposed to be Hungary's allies, they're absolutely furious and terrified. They realize they're not safe in Hungary, that these people who promised them protection just murdered their leaders. So they do the only thing that makes sense. They leave, but they don't leave quietly. As the Cumans flee south toward the Balkans, they burn and loot their way through Hungarian territory. Not because they're evil, but because they're angry, they're scared. They need supplies for a long journey, and frankly, they feel betrayed. Can you blame them? They came as refugees, converted to a foreign religion, swore loyalty to a foreign king, and in return they got murdered. So now you've got 40,000 displaced people cutting a path of destruction through southern Hungary. Magyar villages are burning. The civilian population is being caught in the crossfire, and the Hungarian army has just lost 10,000 experienced horsemen who could have made a real difference against the Mongols. It's a self-inflicted disaster of breathtaking stupidity. Bela is reportedly devastated when he hears about this. He'd protected the Cumans, integrated them, saw them as allies, and his own nobles killed them. Now those nobles are looking at him like, well, what are you going to do about it? And Bela realizes he can't do anything. He needs these nobles and their troops to fight the Mongols. He can't afford to punish them right now. So he swallows his anger and tries to focus on the immediate threat. Problem number 2. Duke Frederick of Austria. You'd think that when a massive invasion threatens all of Christian Europe, neighbouring kingdoms would band together, right? You'd think basic self-interest would compel Austria to help Hungary, because if Hungary falls, Austria is next. Duke Frederick doesn't see it that way. Frederick is one of those medieval rulers who only thinks in terms of immediate personal advantage. Bela has sent him multiple requests for military aid. Frederick's response? He'll help for a price. Specifically, he wants Hungarian territory. 3 entire counties on the Hungarian-Austrian border. Bela refuses. He's not going to give away parts of his kingdom just to get help defending it. So Frederick does worse than refuse to help. He actually sends a small Austrian force to assist Hungary, but with secret orders to stay near the border, not engage in serious fighting, and basically be useless while watching to see how things play out. It gets even worse. Frederick is apparently hoping that Hungary and the Mongols will exhaust each other in battle, after which he can swoop in and grab territory from whoever's left standing. That's not strategic thinking. That's vulture behaviour. And when the Hungarian situation gets truly desperate, when Bela needs support the most, Frederick's troops just leave. They march back to Austria, leaving Hungary to face the Mongols alone. Have you ever been in a situation where you needed help and someone who should have been there for you just bailed? Maybe a friend who disappeared when things got tough. That's what's happening here, except the stakes aren't hurt feelings, it's the survival of a kingdom. So Bela has lost the Cumans, he's lost Austrian support, and he's watching his southern territories burn while Mongol armies approach from 3 directions. His week keeps getting worse. Problem number 3. Logistics and communication. Bela's army of 80,000 to 100,000 men is impressive, but it's also a nightmare to manage. Medieval armies didn't have radio communication, didn't have GPS, didn't have any way to coordinate except by sending messengers on horses, which could take hours or days. Bela is getting reports of Mongol forces in multiple places, but the reports are contradictory, delayed and confusing. One messenger says there's a Mongol army of 30,000 approaching from the north. Another says 20,000 from the east. Another says they've seen Mongol scouts near Pest. Are these separate armies or the same army moving really fast? How many Mongols are there total? Where's the main force? Bela doesn't know. He can't know. His intelligence is fragmentary and hours behind real time. Meanwhile, Subutai knows exactly where Bela is, exactly how many men he has, and exactly what he's planning to do. Because Mongol scouts and spies have been tracking the Hungarian army's every move, It's like playing chess against someone who can see the board while you're blindfolded. By early April, Bela makes a decision. He's going to march his entire army to meet what he thinks is the main Mongol force coming from the northeast. He positions his army near a river called the Sajo, near a place called Mohi, in northeastern Hungary. It's actually a decent defensive position. The river provides a natural barrier. There's a bridge that the Mongols will have to cross to reach him. He can fortify his camp, set up defensive positions, and force the Mongols to attack him on ground of his choosing. It's not a bad plan, tactically speaking. Any European commander would approve, but Bela has made several critical errors, and he doesn't realize any of them. Error number 1. He thinks he's facing one Mongol army. He's actually facing 3 that are about to converge on his position. Error number 2. He's formed his wagons into a defensive lega, a circle of wagons around his camp for protection. This is a standard tactic against nomadic armies, but it also means his army is trapped in a confined space with limited exits. If the defences break, there's nowhere to maneuver, nowhere to retreat effectively. Error number 3. He's positioned his army with the river at their back. If they need to retreat, they'll have to cross the river under fire. It's the same mistake countless commanders have made throughout history, choosing a defensive position that becomes a death trap if things go wrong. And things are going to go very, very wrong. The night of April 10th, 1241, Bela's army is camped on the plain of Mohi, near the Sajo River. Soldiers are sleeping, confident in their numbers, in their defences, in their cause. They're defending their homeland. God is on their side. They have the best cavalry in Europe. What could possibly go wrong? Across the river, Mongol forces are gathering, but they're not forming up for a standard battle. They're splitting into multiple groups, each with specific objectives, each moving into position under cover of darkness. Subutai, remember, he's 65 years old, being carried in a wagon because he's too heavy to ride. He's positioned himself on a hill where he can see the entire battlefield. He's got his flag system set up, ready to send signals to his commanders. And he's put together a battle plan that's going to be studied in military academies for the next 800 years. Here's what's brilliant about Subutai's plan. He's not trying to defeat the Hungarian army through superior numbers or firepower. He's going to use psychology. He's going to manipulate their fear, their instincts, their basic human nature against them. The Mongols have identified every weakness in the Hungarian position. They know about the limited exits from the camp. They know the river is at the Hungarians' back. They know that if they can create panic, if they can break the Hungarian formation, those 100,000 soldiers will become a terrified mob with nowhere to go. And Subutai has a special trick planned. Something the Hungarians have never seen before. Something that's going to tip an already precarious situation into absolute catastrophe. But we'll get to that in a moment. Right now, as midnight passes and April 11th begins, Hungarian sentries are nervous but alert. They can hear sounds from across the river, movement, horses, the murmur of many men preparing for battle. Some of the more experienced soldiers have this nagging feeling that something's wrong, that they're missing something important. They are. They're missing that they're not in a defensive position. They're in a trap that's about to spring shut with devastating force. King Bela, if he's sleeping at all, is probably having nightmares. He's lost his Cuman allies, lost Austrian support, and is about to face an enemy that destroyed every army they've encountered. He knows what happened in Russia. He's heard the reports about Legnica, though the news probably hasn't reached him yet. The timing is that close. Part of him must know, on some level, that tomorrow is going to be the fight of his life, that everything, his kingdom, his people, his legacy, is riding on the next 24 hours. What he doesn't know is that tomorrow is going to be worse than anything he's imagined. That Subutai is about to demonstrate exactly why he's considered one of the greatest military minds in history. That the Battle of Mohi is going to become a textbook example of how to destroy an army through superior tactics, even when outnumbered. And he certainly doesn't know that the sunrise he's about to see will be the last dawn of Hungary as he knows it. So let's watch the sun rise on April 11th, 1241. Let's watch as one of the most devastating battles in medieval history unfolds. Let's see what happens when a 65-year-old genius in a wagon faces off against one of Europe's largest armies. Because what's about to happen at Mohi isn't just a battle. It's a masterpiece of military art, a perfect execution of strategy and tactics that will leave 60,000 men dead and a kingdom in ruins. And it all begins in just a few hours. The attack begins in darkness. It's around 2 a.m. on April 11th, 1241, and most of the Hungarian army is asleep. A few sentries are awake, staring across the Sajó River into the blackness, listening to the unsettling sounds of Mongol preparations. But nobody's expecting an attack in the middle of the night. Medieval armies don't usually fight at night. It's too chaotic, too difficult to coordinate, too easy for everything to go wrong. The Mongols don't fight like medieval armies. A Mongol division, probably around 10,000 to 15,000 cavalry, has been moving quietly south along the river for hours. They've found a ford, a shallow crossing point about a mile downstream from the main Hungarian camp, and in the pre-dawn darkness, they're crossing the river in near silence. Thousands of horses walking through water, making almost no sound. It's an incredibly difficult maneuver that requires intense discipline and training. By 3 a.m., they're across, and they're moving into position south of the Hungarian camp completely undetected. Meanwhile, at the stone bridge directly in front of the Hungarian camp, the bridge that Bela has fortified with guards and barricades, the main Mongol force begins its assault. But this isn't a subtle infiltration. This is loud, violent, and designed to draw every Hungarian eye toward that single point. The Hungarian guards at the bridge see Mongol cavalry approaching in the darkness. They hear the thunder of hooves, the war cries, the whistling of thousands of arrows. The alarm is raised, drums beat, horns blow, soldiers stumble out of their tents, grabbing weapons, trying to understand what's happening. King Bela, jolted awake, rushes to assess the situation. His commanders are reporting that the Mongols are trying to force the bridge. It's a strong position, stone bridge, fortified guards, the river as a barrier. The Hungarians should be able to hold this, and for a while, they do. Hungarian crossbowmen and armoured knights defend the bridge fiercely. The Mongols attacking the bridge are taking casualties. Bodies are piling up. It looks like the defensive position is working exactly as planned. Bela might even feel a moment of hope. Maybe this won't be like Russia. Maybe the Mongols can be stopped. Then the Mongols bring up their catapults. Now remember, Subutai learned siege warfare from Chinese engineers. The Mongols have been using sophisticated siege equipment for decades. So while Hungarian commanders are thinking this is a cavalry battle, the Mongols start bombarding the bridge defences with catapults launching stones and incendiary devices. But that's not even the terrifying part. Contemporary sources mention that the Mongols deployed something that created tremendous explosions and fire. Likely primitive gunpowder bombs similar to what they'd used at Kiev and in China. Picture this. You're a Hungarian defender. It's still dark. You're fighting desperately to hold the bridge, and suddenly there are explosions like nothing you've ever experienced. Flames, smoke, noise that sounds like the world ending. Some historians believe this was the first use of gunpowder weapons in a major European battle. Whether that's technically true or not, the psychological impact was devastating. Defenders who'd never heard an explosion in their lives thought it was sorcery, demonic power, the wrath of God. Under this barrage, the bridge defences begin to crumble, the guards are falling back, and Mongol cavalry starts pouring across. This is around 4 or 5 a.m. now. It's still dark, maybe just beginning to lighten. The Hungarian camp is in chaos, soldiers trying to form up, commanders shouting orders, nobody quite sure what's happening. The Mongols are across the river and attacking the camp perimeter, but here's where Subutai's genius really shows. The frontal assault on the bridge? That was never meant to be the main attack. It was meant to fix the Hungarian army in place, to keep them focused forward, defending their fortifications, thinking they're fighting the battle they prepared for. The real attack is coming from the south. That division that crossed downstream, they've been moving into position this entire time, and just as dawn breaks, just as the Hungarians are fully engaged fighting the frontal assault, 10,000 to 15,000 Mongol cavalry come screaming out of the morning mist from the south, hitting the Hungarian camp from behind. It's a classic hammer and anvil. The Mongols attacking from the bridge are the anvil. They fix the enemy in place. The force from the south is the hammer. They crush the enemy against that fixed position. The Hungarian camp dissolves into pandemonium. Soldiers who were facing north suddenly have enemies behind them. The carefully organized defensive position becomes a confused melee where nobody knows which direction the enemy is coming from. Units get separated from their commanders. The chain of command breaks down. And remember that wagon leg Bela set up for protection? Those wagons that were supposed to provide defensive cover? Now they're obstacles preventing Hungarian soldiers from maneuvering, from forming proper battle lines, from retreating in good order. The Mongols, meanwhile, are executing a battle plan that's been rehearsed and refined through decades of warfare. Every unit knows its role. The communication system is working perfectly. Flags and signals directing movements, coordinating attacks, responding to changing battlefield conditions. It's professional military excellence versus desperate improvisation. And there's only one way that ends. By mid-morning, the Hungarian defensive position has completely collapsed. The camp is overrun. Thousands of Hungarian soldiers are already dead. The rest are trapped in a nightmare, surrounded by Mongol cavalry, taking arrows from every direction, unable to mount an effective counterattack. King Bela, to his credit, hasn't fled. He's there with his men, trying to rally his forces, trying to organize some kind of coordinated response. But it's like trying to reorganize a shattered mirror. The pieces are all there, but you can't put them back together under fire. And then Subutai springs his final brilliant trap. The Mongol encirclement around the Hungarian camp is almost complete. Almost. But there's one gap. A corridor heading west, away from the battle, toward the safety of the Hungarian heartland. It's not obvious, not heavily defended, just open. To the terrified Hungarian soldiers, this looks like an escape route, a way out of the slaughter, and human nature being what it is, when people are trapped and terrified and see a way out, they take it. Soldiers start fleeing through that gap. First a trickle, then a flood. The Hungarian army, one of the largest in Europe, begins to disintegrate as individuals and small groups break and run for their lives. Have you ever seen footage of a stampede? How once it starts, it can't be stopped. How the herd instinct takes over and everyone just runs. That's what's happening to the Hungarian army. Except it's not animals. It's 80,000 to 100,000 men, most of them now in full panic, abandoning their weapons, their armor, anything that might slow them down. King Bela sees this happening and realizes there's no stopping it. His army isn't retreating in good order. It's disintegrating, and if he stays, he'll die with it. So he makes the hardest decision a commander can make. He flees too, hoping to survive to rebuild, to fight another day. Here's the brutal brilliance of Subutais' plan. That gap wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. It was designed to turn a difficult battle into a massacre. See, when an army is surrounded and fighting desperately, they'll fight to the death. Cornered men are dangerous. They have nothing to lose, so they fight with suicidal courage. The Mongols would take heavy casualties trying to finish them off. But if you give them an escape route, if you let them think they can survive by running, they'll break formation, drop their weapons and flee in a disorganized mob. And then you can hunt them down at your leisure with cavalry, picking them off one by one as they run. It's what Subutai did at the Kalka River. It's what he did at countless other battles, and it worked here with devastating efficiency. The escape route led through marshy, difficult terrain, bad footing for horses, exhausting for infantry. Exactly the kind of ground where fleeing soldiers can't run fast, can't defend themselves, can't do anything except die tired. Mongol cavalry pursued the fleeing Hungarians for over 40 miles. Some sources say as far as 65 miles. They hunted them through forests, across rivers, into villages. Chroniclers describe the Mongol archers riding alongside fleeing groups, shooting them down like they were hunting deer. No mercy, no prisoners, just systematic slaughter. One account describes Hungarian soldiers stripping off their armour to run faster, then being shot down by Mongol arrows. Another describes men drowning while trying to cross rivers in their desperation to escape. Another mentions groups of soldiers cornered in churches, begging for mercy that never came. By the end of the day, and the pursuit continued well into the next day, out of an army of 80,000 to 100,000 men, maybe 30,000 to 40,000 survived. Some sources suggest the casualties were even worse. We're talking about 60,000 to 70,000 men killed in a single battle and its aftermath. That's not just a military defeat. That's a demographic catastrophe. That's an entire generation of Hungarian men, fathers, sons, brothers, gone in 24 hours. The Hungarian nobility was virtually wiped out. Almost every major noble family lost someone at Mohi. Some lost entire lineages. The military and political leadership of the kingdom was devastated in a single afternoon. King Bela escaped, but barely. He fled west, then south into Croatia, constantly moving, never feeling safe. His kingdom was in ruins, his army was destroyed, and Mongol cavalry was hunting him personally. And here's something that really shows the scale of the disaster. Hungary, before the Mongol invasion, had a population of around 2 million people. After the invasion and its aftermath, the population had dropped to about 1 million. Half the population. Gone. Some died in battle. Some died when Mongol forces ravaged the countryside over the following months. Some died of starvation when agricultural systems collapsed. Some fled to other countries and never came back. It's one of the worst demographic catastrophes in European history. And it happened because a 65-year-old general in a wagon designed a perfect battle plan and executed it flawlessly. Military historians rank the Battle of Mohi as one of the most one-sided victories in warfare. British military theorist B.H. Liddell Hart called it a masterpiece of operational art. Modern military academies study it as an example of how to achieve victory through superior strategy, despite numerical disadvantage. The Mongols probably lost a few thousand men. Casualty estimates vary, but it's generally thought to be relatively light compared to their victories. The Hungarians lost their kingdom, and remember, This battle happened exactly 2 days after Legnica. Just like Subutai planned, 2 major European armies destroyed within 48 hours, several hundred miles apart, all part of a single coordinated campaign. Think about that level of military planning and execution in 1241, with no modern communication, with armies operating independently but in perfect sync. It's staggering. After Mohi, there was no organized military force capable of stopping the Mongols between Hungary and the Atlantic Ocean. Poland was destroyed. Hungary was destroyed. Germany was fragmented and terrified. Austria was unhelpful at best. Italy was divided. France wasn't ready. The road west was open, and the Mongols knew it. In the months following Mohi, Mongol forces spread across Hungary like water flowing downhill. Buda fell, Pest fell, Esztergom, the capital, fell. Churches were burned, monasteries looted, cities emptied. The Mongols weren't just conquering territory, they were systematically dismantling Hungarian civilization. Some Mongol detachments even pushed into Austria, Croatia, and the northern Italian states, raiding and scouting, testing defences, gathering intelligence for the next phase of the invasion. Western European leaders received refugees, heard reports, and finally, started to understand that this wasn't an exaggeration, wasn't a regional problem, wasn't going to solve itself. This was an existential threat to all of Christendom. Pope Innocent IV tried to organise a crusade. German princes started mobilizing. Venetian merchants stopped trading and started fortifying. Everyone was preparing for the storm that was surely coming. And then, something happened. Something completely unexpected that would change everything. But before I tell you what saved Europe, what stopped the unstoppable Mongol invasion just when it seemed certain to sweep all the way to the Atlantic, I need you to understand what Europe was facing in the summer of 1241. No major armies left, no coordinated defence, no clear plan, just a loose collection of terrified kingdoms watching the horizon, waiting for the Mongol cavalry to appear, knowing they couldn't stop it when it came. It was Europe's darkest hour, and what happened next will make you question everything you think you know about how history works. Summer 1241. If you're a European Christian living anywhere west of Hungary, your world has fundamentally changed in the past few months, and not in a good way. Refugees are flooding into your towns and villages, Polish survivors with horrifying stories, Hungarian families who fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs, monks from destroyed monasteries carrying relics because that's all they could save. And they're all telling the same story. An army of demons from the east has destroyed everything in its path, and nothing can stop them. At first, people didn't believe these stories. Surely they were exaggerations. Surely someone was doing something. Surely God wouldn't allow Christian kingdoms to be wiped from the face of the earth. But then the nobles started arriving, and when noblemen, people with wealth and power and no reason to abandon their estates, when they start fleeing in terror, you know something is genuinely, catastrophically wrong. By June of 1241, Western Europe is experiencing something close to mass hysteria. And the terrifying thing is the hysteria is completely rational, because the situation actually is that bad. Let me paint you a picture of what Europe looks like in the summer of 1241, because this is important for understanding just how close Western civilization came to complete destruction. Poland, destroyed. Not defeated, destroyed. Multiple duchies ravaged, cities burned, armies annihilated. The survivors are scattered, hiding in forests and fortified towns, unable to mount any organized resistance. It'll take Poland decades to recover, and in some regions the population never returns to pre-invasion levels. Hungary, even worse. King Bela is in hiding in Croatia, moving from fortress to fortress, never staying in one place long enough for Mongol scouts to find him. His kingdom, which months ago was one of the strongest in Europe, now exists mostly as a theoretical concept. Half his population is dead or fled. The administrative structure has collapsed. There's no government, no army, no tax collection, no law enforcement. Just Mongol cavalry ranging freely across the countryside, doing whatever they want. And they're being methodical about it. This isn't random raiding. The Mongols are systematically destroying Hungarian infrastructure, burning crops, killing livestock, dismantling fortifications. They're not just conquering Hungary, they're ensuring that even if they leave, Hungary won't be able to threaten them for generations. It's strategic devastation on a scale Europe hasn't seen since the fall of the Roman Empire. In July 1241, Mongol forces cross into Croatia, still hunting King Bela. They sack Zagreb. Imagine that, one of the major cities in the Balkans, taken and burned by an invasion force that's supposedly thousands of miles from home. The Mongols are operating so far west that they're literally off the edge of the intelligence maps most Western European kingdoms have. Mongol detachments push even further. They raid into Austria. Duke Frederick, who refused to help Hungary, now gets to watch Mongol cavalry burn his border towns. They probe into northern Italy. They send scouts toward Venice and Vienna. They're gathering intelligence, testing defences, mapping out routes for the full invasion that everyone knows is coming. Vienna itself is attacked. Not a full siege, just raiding parties, but enough to make it clear that nowhere is safe. Duke Frederick, to his credit, manages to rally his forces and drive off the Mongol raiders. It's one of the few successful defensive actions in this entire campaign. But Frederick knows, everyone knows, that these were just scouts. The real army hasn't arrived yet. Pope Innocent IV, who took office in June 1243 after Gregory IX died during the crisis, tries to organize a coordinated European response. He sends letters to every Christian monarch. This is an existential threat. Stop fighting each other. Pool your resources. Raise armies. Do something. And you know what? For maybe the first time in medieval history, European kingdoms actually start listening. When the Pope says stop your wars and work together, and kingdoms actually do it, you know the threat must be terrifying. Germany, which for years has been a patchwork of rival princes and dukes constantly fighting each other, they suddenly start cooperating. They're holding councils, raising troops, building fortifications. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who's been feuding with the Pope for years, even offers to put aside their differences and lead a crusade against the Mongols. France starts mobilizing. King Louis IX, who'll later be known as Saint Louis, begins assembling an army and planning defensive strategies. England, even though they're across the Channel and theoretically safer, they're preparing too. Nobody wants to be the next Hungary. Italian city-states are fortifying their walls, hiring mercenaries, building emergency stockpiles of weapons and food. Venice, with its wealth and maritime power, becomes a centre for refugees and a hub for organising resistance. Even rival kingdoms that hate each other are signing truces. Okay, we were about to go to war over this disputed territory, but let's maybe table that discussion until after we deal with the horse-riding apocalypse heading our way. It's unprecedented cooperation born of unprecedented terror. But here's the problem, and it's a huge problem. Nobody knows how to fight the Mongols. Every European army that's faced them has been destroyed. Every tactical approach has failed. Every defensive position has been overrun. The few survivors who've actually fought the Mongols and lived to tell about it, they all say the same thing. Nothing we tried worked. They're faster than us, better coordinated than us. They have superior intelligence, and they fight in ways we don't understand. Our heavy cavalry, the pride of European warfare, might as well be statues. Our fortifications slow them down but can't stop them. Our commanders don't know how to respond to their tactics. It's like if your entire military doctrine became obsolete overnight. Imagine training your whole life to be the best at something, and then discovering that someone invented a completely new game and you don't even know the rules. Some European commanders try to learn from the disasters. They interview survivors, study the pattern of Mongol attacks, try to adapt. A few insights emerge. Don't chase them when they retreat. It's probably a trap. Don't let them draw you into open ground where their cavalry has room to maneuver. Stay near fortifications. Use crossbowmen, because at least they can engage Mongol archers at range. Don't split your forces. Keep supply lines protected. Maintain intelligence networks. These are all good ideas. The problem is the Mongols have counters for all of them. They've been fighting sophisticated opponents for decades. Every trick European commanders come up with, the Mongols have probably seen a version of it before. It's the fundamental problem of fighting a more experienced, more innovative enemy. You're always one step behind, always reacting rather than dictating the terms of engagement, and time is running out. By summer's end, once the grass on the Hungarian plain has been consumed by the Mongol horse herds, once the harvest season is over and new supplies are available, the invasion will resume. Everyone knows it. The Mongols aren't leaving. They're resting, consolidating, preparing for the next phase. Subutai, who's now 66 years old and probably thinking this might be his last great campaign, is reportedly finalizing plans for a winter invasion of Central Europe. Winter again. Because Subutai loves using winter as a weapon. Frozen rivers become highways. Defenders are less prepared. His cavalry can move faster than anyone expects. The strategic target is Germany. Once Germany falls, France is exposed. Once France is threatened, England starts looking very conquerable. The Mongols have shown they can coordinate amphibious operations. They conquered coastal Korea. They know how to use ships. A Mongol-controlled continent could potentially threaten England by sea. This isn't paranoid speculation. This is European leaders looking at what's already happened and extrapolating the logical next steps, and those next steps lead to the complete Mongol conquest of Europe. Imagine being a king or duke in 1241, knowing what's coming and realizing you might be the monarch who loses not just a battle, not just a war, but an entire civilization. That your name will go down in history, if there's anyone left to write history, as the person who presided over the end of Christendom. The pressure must have been unbearable. There are accounts of churches across Europe holding continuous prayer vigils, priests preaching that the Mongols are God's punishment for European sins, apocalyptic interpretations of biblical prophecy suggesting the end times have arrived. Some people are literally preparing for the apocalypse, giving away their possessions, confessing their sins, making peace with their deaths. And you know what's tragic? From their perspective, this response makes perfect sense. Everything they've seen suggests that the Mongols are unstoppable, that resistance is futile, that European civilization is about to end. They're not being dramatic. They're being rational. In monasteries, monks are copying important manuscripts and hiding them, hoping that someday someone might find them and remember that European civilization existed. In cathedrals, treasures are being buried. In castles, nobles are writing what they think might be their final letters to family members. It's preparation for cultural extinction. And militarily, the situation is only getting worse. Because the Mongols aren't just sitting idle in Hungary, they're building. They're constructing siege equipment, training additional forces, incorporating captured Hungarian and Russian auxiliaries into their army. They're turning Hungary into a massive forward operating base for invading the rest of Europe. Some Mongol detachments even reach the Adriatic Sea. There are reports of Mongol scouts near the coast, watching Venetian ships, studying maritime defences. The Mongols, who started as steppe nomads, are now contemplating naval operations in the Mediterranean. That's how adaptable they are. By late 1241, the military balance in Europe looks something like this. The Mongols have maybe 100,000 to 120,000 cavalry in Europe, battle-hardened, experienced, led by the greatest military commanders of the age, with perfect logistics and intelligence networks. Europe can theoretically raise much larger armies. Combined, the kingdoms of Europe could potentially field 300,000 to 400,000 soldiers, but they can't actually combine them effectively. Different languages, different tactical doctrines, different command structures, mutual distrust, logistics problems. A coalition European army would be a coordination nightmare. And even if they somehow managed to assemble this massive force and coordinate effectively, they'd still be using tactics that have already proven ineffective against the Mongols. Numbers alone don't win battles. If they did, the Hungarians would have won at Mohi. So Europe is facing an enemy they can't beat militarily, can't match strategically, and can't even meaningfully slow down. The only real hope is that somehow, by some miracle, the Mongols decide to stop their invasion voluntarily, which seems about as likely as the sun deciding not to rise. And yet, December 11th, 1241, a date that nobody in Europe knows is significant yet, a date that will change everything, though the news won't reach Western Europe for months. In Karakorum, Mongolia, thousands of miles to the east, Ögedei Khan, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire, is having a bad day. Actually, he's having his last day, though he doesn't know it yet. Ögedei is 56 years old, and he's been partying. There was a hunting trip earlier in the day, very successful, lots of game killed. To celebrate, Ögedei did what he often did. He drank. A lot. All night, drinking with his companions, one of whom was a man named Abdur Rahman. Contemporary sources suggest Ögedei had a serious alcohol problem. His brother Chagatai was so worried about it that he assigned someone to monitor Ögedei's drinking. Ögedei's response was to agree to drink fewer cups per day, then have cups made that were twice the normal size. It's almost funny, except it's about to change world history. At dawn on December 11th, after a night of heavy drinking, Ögedei Khan dies. The sources are somewhat vague about the exact cause. Some suggest stroke, others organ failure, others hint at poisoning. What's certain is that the ruler of the largest empire in human history is suddenly, unexpectedly dead, and that changes everything. Here's why. Mongol succession law, established by Genghis Khan himself, requires that when a great Khan dies, all the princes of the blood, all the male descendants of Genghis Khan, must return to Mongolia for the Kurultai, the great council that will elect the next Khan. This isn't optional. This isn't send a representative. This is, you personally must be there, or you forfeit any claim to power or influence in the empire, which means Batu Khan, commanding the Mongol forces in Europe, has to leave immediately. Because if he doesn't, his political rivals will elect the next Khan without him, and he'll lose all his power and influence. He might even be seen as a traitor to Mongol law. The news takes months to reach Europe. Remember, even with the fast Mongol communication system, a message has to travel from Mongolia to Hungary, a journey of thousands of miles through winter terrain. The messenger probably left Mongolia in December and reached Batu Khan sometime in February or March 1242. And Batu faces a choice that must have been agonizing. He's on the verge of conquering Western Europe. His armies are rested, supplied, ready to resume the campaign. Subutai has the plans drawn up. The next phase of the invasion is ready to launch. Victory is within reach, but if he stays to finish the conquest, he loses the political struggle back home. His cousin Guyuk, Ogedei's son, will become Khan, and Guyuk hates Batu. If Guyuk becomes Khan without Batu there to oppose him, Batu might find himself stripped of power, exiled, or worse. So Batu makes the only choice he can make. He orders the withdrawal. The entire Mongol army, at the peak of its power, on the edge of complete victory, turns around and goes home. Not because they were defeated, not because they ran out of supplies, not because European resistance was too strong. They left because of a drinking binge in Mongolia thousands of miles away, and Europe is saved by wine and succession politics and the death of a man most Europeans had never heard of. If you wrote this in a novel, editors would reject it as too convenient, too implausible, but it's what actually happened. So let's talk about what this meant, what changed, and why the Mongols never came back to finish what they started. Because that's a story in itself. Imagine you're a European peasant in the spring of 1242. You've spent months in terror, waiting for the Mongol cavalry to appear on the horizon. You've heard the stories: cities burned, armies destroyed, entire kingdoms erased. You've watched refugees stream past your village. You've listened to priests tell you to prepare your soul because the end is coming, and then one day the Mongols leave, not defeated, not driven out. They just pack up their massive armies and ride east, back toward the steppes, back toward Asia, and nobody understands why. The initial European reaction isn't relief, it's confusion. Is this a trick? Are they coming back with more forces? Is this like those feigned retreats everyone's heard about, but on a strategic scale? It takes weeks for word to spread that the Mongols are actually withdrawing, not repositioning. And even then, people don't believe it. European scouts follow the Mongol armies eastward, watching them cross back over the Carpathian Mountains, watching them disappear into Russia, reporting back, they're actually leaving. They're really going. And Europe exhales a collective breath it's been holding for months. But here's what's fascinating. For a long time, Europeans don't know why the Mongols left. The news of Ogedei Khan's death doesn't reach Western Europe for months after the withdrawal begins. So Europeans are left trying to figure out what made them leave, what saved us. The most common explanation, the one that Pope Innocent IV and many Christian leaders promote, is divine intervention. God heard the prayers of the faithful and drove the invaders away. It's a miracle, a sign that God protects Christendom in its darkest hour. And you know what? From their perspective, what else could it be? An unstoppable army on the verge of total victory just turns around and goes home for no apparent reason. That doesn't make sense unless God intervened. Contemporary chroniclers write things like, "The Lord sent his angel to strike down the enemies of Christendom, and God in his mercy delivered us from the sons of darkness." One chronicler, Giovanni da Pian del Carpini, who actually travelled to Mongolia a few years later as a papal envoy, he explicitly writes that God caused Ogedei's death to save Christian Europe. It's a comforting narrative. It reinforces faith. It gives meaning to the suffering. And honestly, given what they knew at the time, it's not an unreasonable conclusion. But the reality, when Europeans eventually learn it, is somehow even more extraordinary than divine intervention. Because what saved Europe wasn't supernatural. It was alcohol, family politics, and a 56-year-old man's inability to hold his liquor. Let me walk you through what actually happened after Ögedei died, because the political dynamics are fascinating and they explain why the Mongols never came back. When news of Ögedei's death reaches Batu Khan in Hungary, probably around February or March 1242, Batu is furious. Not sad, not grieving. Furious. Because Batu and Ögedei's son Guyuk hate each other. Deeply, personally hate each other. This hatred goes back years. During the Russian campaign, Guyuk and Batu had gotten into arguments about strategy, about credit for victories, about who should command what. At one point, Guyuk apparently refused to drink at a feast until Batu drank first, which in Mongol culture is a massive insult. Batu responded by essentially telling Guyuk he was an arrogant child who didn't deserve his position. It got so bad that other Mongol princes had to intervene to prevent an actual duel. So when Ögedei dies, Batu knows exactly what's going to happen. Guyuk is going to make a play for the throne, and if Batu isn't there to oppose him, Guyuk will become Great Khan, and Batu will be in serious danger. Mongol succession is supposed to work through the Kurultai, the Grand Council where all the princes vote. But in practice it's a vicious political struggle. Whoever controls the Kurultai, whoever gets there first with the most supporters, whoever plays the politics best, that person becomes Khan, regardless of merit or birthright. Batu faces an impossible choice. Stay in Europe and win a historic military victory but lose the political war at home, or abandon the European campaign and rush back to Mongolia to fight for his political survival. He chooses survival, and honestly, can you blame him? Military glory doesn't mean much if you're exiled or executed. But here's where it gets interesting. Batu doesn't actually go all the way back to Mongolia. He withdraws to the Volga River region, what will become the heartland of his own kingdom, the Golden Horde. And then he just stops. He doesn't attend the Kurultai. He doesn't participate in the succession process. He essentially says, I'm not going to fight for the throne, but I'm also not going to acknowledge whoever you choose. It's a brilliant political move, actually. By not showing up, he can't be forced to swear loyalty to Guyuk. But by staying in his own territory with his army, he makes it clear that he's too powerful to be threatened. The Kurultai, meanwhile, becomes a mess. Ögedei's widow, Töregene Khatun, acts as regent and tries to secure the throne for her son Guyuk. But not everyone supports Guyuk. Remember, he's arrogant, he has enemies, and many Mongol princes remember his conflicts with Batu. The political struggle drags on for 5 years. 5 years. From 1241 to 1246, the Mongol Empire has no Great Khan, just various factions maneuvering for power, while Töregene holds things together as regent. During this period, Mongol armies are paralyzed. They can't launch major campaigns without the Great Khan's authorization. They can raid, they can maintain control of conquered territories, but they can't execute Subutai's grand strategy for conquering Western Europe. And Subutai? The 65-year-old genius who designed the invasion, who came so close to conquering Europe? He's recalled to Mongolia to help deal with political matters, because in Mongol culture military commanders serve the Khan, and when there's no Khan, everything stops. Subutai spends his final years not conquering new territories but dealing with bureaucracy and politics. He campaigns against the Song dynasty in China in 1246-1247, his last military operation, then retires to his herds in Mongolia. He dies in 1248 at age 72, having conquered more territory than any military commander in history, but never completing his greatest campaign. Can you imagine how frustrating that must have been? You're the greatest general of your age. You've designed a perfect strategy. You've destroyed every army in your path. Victory is literally within your grasp. And then politics forces you to abandon it all and go home. It's like if Eisenhower had to abandon D-Day halfway through because of an election back in Washington. By the time Guyuk finally becomes Great Khan in 1246, the situation has completely changed. 5 years have passed. The Mongol armies in Europe have shrunk as soldiers return home or die or are reassigned. The intelligence networks have degraded. European kingdoms have had time to fortify, to prepare, to recover some strength. And Guyuk, who never liked Batu, is more interested in settling scores with his cousin than in conquering Europe. There are reports that Guyuk was actually planning to attack Batu, to eliminate his rival once and for all. Batu responds by building up his own forces, preparing for a Mongol civil war. But before this war can happen, Guyuk dies in 1248, possibly poisoned, possibly from natural causes, nobody's quite sure. He'd been Great Khan for less than 2 years. Another succession crisis. More political manoeuvring. Eventually Mongol Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan through a different line, becomes Great Khan in 1251. Mongol is more diplomatic than Guyuk, more interested in consolidating the empire than in internal conflicts. And Mongol has a problem. The Mongol Empire is overstretched. They're fighting in China, in the Middle East, maintaining control over Russia, dealing with rebellions. Europe, which seemed so close to conquest in 1241, now seems less important than other strategic priorities. Batu Khan does prepare for a renewed invasion of Europe around 1255. He's got plans, he's got forces, he's ready to finish what Subutai started. But then Batu dies, age around 48, probably from illness. His son intends to carry out the invasion, but he dies too within a year. It's like Europe has the world's best luck. Every time the Mongols get close to resuming the invasion, a key leader dies. Batu's brother Berke becomes Khan of the Golden Horde in 1258, and he makes a crucial decision. He converts to Islam. This changes everything, because now his strategic priorities shift. He's more interested in supporting fellow Muslims in the Middle East than in conquering Christian Europe. He even allies with the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt against his cousin Hulagu, who's conquering the Middle East for the Mongol Empire. So now you've got Mongol princes fighting each other over religion and territory, and Europe is just not a priority anymore. There are later Mongol raids into Poland, one in 1259, another in 1287. Both are destructive, both cause panic, but neither is a serious attempt at conquest. They're more like reminders. We could come back if we wanted to. Don't forget that. But the organizational capacity, the strategic vision, the overwhelming military superiority that characterized the 1241 invasion, that's gone. It died with Ögedei, with Subutai, with the political unity that Genghis Khan had built. By the late 1200s, the Mongol Empire is fragmenting into separate khanates. The Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Yuan dynasty in China. They're technically one empire, but in practice they're separate states that sometimes fight each other, and none of them have the capacity or desire to conquer Western Europe. So Europe got saved by the most unlikely sequence of events. A great Khan dying from alcoholism at exactly the right moment, a succession crisis lasting 5 years, a personal feud between two princes, a series of convenient deaths, a religious conversion that changed strategic priorities, and the gradual fragmentation of what had been a unified empire. If any one of those things had gone differently, we might be speaking Mongolian right now. Or at least living in a world where European history took a radically different path. Historians love to debate this. What if Ögedei had lived another 5 years? What if Batu and Guyuk had gotten along? What if Subutai had been allowed to finish his campaign? Most military historians agree, if the 1241 invasion had continued, the Mongols probably would have conquered Germany, and once Germany fell, France wouldn't have been far behind. England, protected by the Channel, might have held out for a while, but even that's not certain. The Mongols had proven they could adapt to any terrain and learn any military technology. We came that close, one drinking binge away from a completely different world history. There's a fascinating account from Giovanni da Pian del Carpini, the papal envoy who visited the Mongol court in 1245–1247. He writes about meeting Mongol princes who still talked about conquering Europe. They'd say things like, "We will return. We will drink from the Great Sea." They believed it was inevitable, just postponed. But it never happened. The moment passed. The window closed, and European civilization survived not because it was stronger, not because it was better prepared, but because history threw it an incredibly lucky break at exactly the right moment. Some people find that disappointing. We want to believe that Europe survived because of courage, faith, superior culture, something meaningful. The truth, that it was basically random chance, feels anticlimactic. But I think there's something almost more profound in the randomness. It shows how fragile history is, how contingent everything is on tiny moments and individual decisions. One man's drinking problem literally changed the course of world history. Makes you wonder what other moments like that have happened, doesn't it? What other times has history pivoted on something small and random that we don't even know about? But we're not quite done with this story yet, because the Mongol invasion of 1241, even though it didn't succeed in conquering Europe, still changed everything. The impact, military, cultural, economic, psychological, reverberated for centuries. So let's talk about what happened next, about how Europe picked up the pieces, about what this near-death experience meant for the future of Western civilization. So the Mongols left. Europe survived. Crisis averted, right? Roll credits. Everyone goes home happy. Not quite. Because what happened after 1242 is in some ways even more fascinating than the invasion itself. It's a story of missed opportunities, strategic shifts, and how the greatest military machine in history gradually lost its edge. Let me start with a question that bothered historians for centuries. Why didn't they try again? Seriously, the Mongols had proven they could destroy any European army. They had the intelligence, the tactics, the organizational capacity. Why not just come back in 5 years or 10 years with fresh armies and finish the job? The simple answer, political chaos and succession crises, we've already covered. But there's a deeper, more interesting answer about how empires work, about strategic priorities, and about a problem that every successful conqueror eventually faces. You can't expand forever. Think about it from the Mongol perspective in the late 1240s. You've conquered the largest empire in human history. It stretches from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to Iraq. That's roughly 12 million square miles of territory, about the size of Africa. Managing that is an administrative nightmare even with modern technology. In the 13th century, it's almost impossible. Every conquered territory needs governors, garrisons, tax collectors, communication systems. Every border needs defending. Every rebellion needs crushing. The Mongols were brilliant at conquest, but even they couldn't be everywhere at once. And here's the crucial point. By the late 1240s, they were running into harder targets. The easy conquests were done. What remained were either heavily fortified, like the castles of Western Europe, or geographically challenging, like the jungles of Southeast Asia, or both. China, for instance. The Song dynasty in southern China was incredibly wealthy, incredibly populated, and incredibly well defended. The Mongols had been trying to conquer them since the 1230s and making almost no progress. They wouldn't finally succeed until 1279. That's almost 50 years of continuous warfare for one conquest. The Middle East was similar, rich, complex, full of fortified cities and challenging terrain. The Mongol conquest of Persia and Iraq took decades and required enormous resources. So Mongol leaders faced a choice: throw resources at conquering Western Europe, which would require years of campaigning through forests and mountains against castle-based defences, or focus on wealthier, more strategically important targets in Asia. From a purely strategic standpoint, China and the Middle East made more sense. More wealth, more resources, more geopolitical importance. Europe was peripheral, relatively poor by Asian standards, and defensively challenging. It's like if you're playing a strategy game and you've got two expansion options. One is moderately difficult with decent rewards, the other is very difficult with massive rewards. Which do you choose? The Mongols chose Asia. And in doing so, Europe got left alone, not because it was strong, but because it wasn't worth the effort compared to other options. That's actually kind of humbling for European history, isn't it? We like to think of medieval Europe as important, as central to world affairs. But from the Mongol perspective, Europe was a backwater, an afterthought, something to deal with eventually, maybe, if they had spare capacity. Now let's talk about Batu Khan and the Golden Horde, because what he created in the aftermath of 1242 is fascinating and often overlooked. Batu withdrew from Hungary but stayed in the Volga River region, essentially modern-day southern Russia and Kazakhstan, and there he established what became known as the Golden Horde, one of the successor states of the Mongol Empire. The Golden Horde controlled Russia for the next 240 years, 2.5 centuries. That's longer than the United States has existed as a country. Think about that impact on Russian history, Russian culture, Russian development. Russian princes had to travel to the Golden Horde's capital to receive permission to rule. They paid tribute. They provided soldiers when demanded. They essentially became vassals to Mongol overlords. This period, the Mongol yoke, fundamentally shaped Russian identity, Russian autocracy, Russian approaches to governance. Some historians argue that Russia's later expansion eastward into Siberia was basically copying Mongol imperial methods, that Russian centralized autocracy was influenced by Mongol administration, that even the Russian postal system was based on the Mongol Yam relay network. The Mongol invasion didn't just happen and then disappear. It created a lasting power structure that dominated Eastern Europe for centuries. But Western Europe? The Mongols just didn't bother. The Golden Horde raided Poland a few times, sent diplomatic missions, maintained a military presence but never attempted serious conquest. They'd established a stable western border at the Carpathian Mountains, and that was apparently good enough. And then in 1258, something happens that completely changes Mongol strategic priorities. Burqa Khan, Batu's brother and successor, converts to Islam. This is huge. Remember, the Mongols had traditionally been shamanists with some Buddhist influence. They were religiously tolerant pragmatists who didn't care what you believed as long as you paid taxes and obeyed orders. But when Burqa converts to Islam, suddenly the Golden Horde has ideological alignment with the Islamic world, and that puts them at odds with their cousin Hulagu, who's conquering the Middle East for the Mongol Empire and destroying Muslim kingdoms. In 1260, Hulagu's Mongol army conquers Baghdad, one of the great cities of the Islamic world, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. The city is sacked, hundreds of thousands killed, the caliph executed. It's a catastrophe for the Islamic world. Berke, as a Muslim, is horrified. And when Hulagu continues pushing into Syria and Egypt, threatening more Muslim territories, Berke actually allies with the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt against him. So now you've got Mongol princes fighting each other over religion. The unified empire that Genghis Khan built is fracturing along religious and political lines. And in this conflict, Europe is completely irrelevant. Nobody's thinking about conquering France when you're fighting a civil war over who controls the Middle East. And then comes 1260 and the Battle of Angelut in modern-day Israel. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt faces a Mongol army, and for the first time in decades the Mongols lose decisively. The myth of Mongol invincibility, which had terrified Europe, is shattered. The Mamluks prove that the Mongols can be beaten using their own tactics: mobile cavalry, feigned retreats, coordinated maneuvers. Turns out, once you understand how the Mongols fight, once you adapt your tactics and train your soldiers properly, they're not unstoppable. This defeat reverberates across the Mongol Empire. If the Mongols can be beaten in the Middle East, maybe they can be beaten elsewhere. Maybe they're not the invincible force everyone thought. And in Europe, as news of Angelut slowly filters westward, there's a collective sigh of relief. The nightmare cavalry that almost destroyed Christendom can be defeated. The psychological terror of the Mongol threat begins to lift. By the late 1200s, the Mongol Empire is clearly fragmenting. You've got the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. They're theoretically one empire under one great Khan, but in practice they're separate states that sometimes trade with each other and sometimes fight each other. And none of them have the unified strategic vision that characterized the 1241 invasion. None of them have a Subutai to design brilliant multi-front campaigns. None of them have the political cohesion to sustain prolonged campaigns far from home. The window for conquering Europe has closed, and it's never going to open again. There are later Mongol raids into Poland and Hungary, 1259, 1287, 1291. Each time, Europe panics, remembers the terror of 1241, mobilizes armies, and each time the raids turn out to be relatively minor, destructive certainly, but not existential threats. The 1287 raid is particularly interesting. A Mongol army under Nogai Khan invades Poland and Hungary, wins some battles, causes chaos. But then Polish and Hungarian forces, using lessons learned from 1241, manage to inflict some defeats on the Mongols. Not complete victories, but enough to make the Mongols withdraw. It's the first time European armies have successfully forced Mongol withdrawal through military action rather than luck. It suggests that Europe has learned something, has adapted, has figured out at least partially how to fight this kind of enemy. The last major Mongol raid into Europe happens in 1291, and it's almost anticlimactic. Some skirmishing, some burned villages, then the Mongols leave. And after that, nothing. The threat that terrorized Europe for decades just fades away. By the early 1300s, the Golden Horde is more interested in trading with Europe than conquering it. Mongol merchants are travelling the Silk Road, facilitating trade between East and West. The relationship shifts from existential military threat to difficult but manageable neighbour. And here's something fascinating. The Mongol conquests, as terrible as they were, actually opened up connections between East and West that hadn't existed before. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, meant that for the first time in centuries you could travel from Europe to China in relative safety. Merchants like Marco Polo made the journey. Ideas, technologies and goods flowed along the Silk Road. Chinese inventions like gunpowder, the compass and printing technology made their way to Europe. partly because the Mongols controlled the routes and facilitated trade, so the civilization that nearly destroyed Europe also helped spark the Renaissance by opening up trade and cultural exchange. History is weird like that. There's also a darker legacy, the Black Death. Many historians believe the bubonic plague that devastated Europe in the 1340s travelled along Mongol trade routes from Central Asia. The same network that brought silks and spices also brought rats and fleas carrying plague. The Mongols might have failed to conquer Europe militarily, but they helped kill a third of its population through disease. That's a grim irony if there ever was one. By the mid-1300s, the Mongol Empire is in clear decline. The Yuan dynasty in China faces rebellions. The Ilkhanate in Persia fragments into smaller states. The Chagatai Khanate splits into competing factions. The Golden Horde remains powerful but isolated. And the military innovations that made the Mongols so terrifying. Europeans are adopting them. Better cavalry tactics, improved reconnaissance, more flexible command structures, use of gunpowder weapons. The technological and tactical gap is closing. By the time the Mongol threat finally disappears in the late 1300s and early 1400s, Europe has fundamentally changed. The trauma of 1241 left a mark. It forced European kingdoms to cooperate in ways they never had before. It pushed military innovation. It created a shared sense of European Christian identity defined partly in opposition to the Mongol threat. Some historians argue that the Mongol invasion was actually beneficial for Europe in the long run, not because of the invasion itself, but because of how Europe responded to it. The crisis forced adaptation, innovation, cooperation. It was a civilizational stress test that Europe ultimately passed. But at what cost? Poland and Hungary took generations to recover. Entire regions were depopulated. Cultural treasures were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands died. The psychological trauma lasted for centuries. Mongol invasions became the boogeyman of European folklore, the standard for devastating foreign invasion. So when we ask why the Mongols never came back, the answer is layered. Political fragmentation, strategic priorities shifting toward Asia, internal conflicts, the difficulty of the target, the declining military edge, the rise of new threats in the Middle East, and ultimately the simple fact that empires don't expand forever. They reach a natural limit and then begin to fragment. The Mongol Empire reached its western limit at Hungary in 1241, not because it was defeated there, but because that's where the expansion stopped making strategic sense, where internal problems became more pressing than external conquest, where the costs began to outweigh the benefits. And Europe survived not through superior virtue or military might, but through a combination of incredible luck and the simple fact that from the Mongol perspective, it wasn't worth the trouble. Which brings us to the final question. What does all this mean? What should we take away from this story of near destruction and unlikely survival? What lessons does 1241 have for us today, 800 years later? Because this isn't just ancient history. This is a story about how civilizations face existential threats, about how random chance shapes history, about how the world can change in ways nobody expects. Let's zoom out for a moment, way out. Imagine you're looking at Earth from space, watching history unfold like a time-lapse video. You see civilizations rise and fall, empires expand and contract, borders shift and change. And right there, in 1241, you see a moment where everything almost went a completely different direction. If Genghis Khan had lived just 5 more years, if Batu and Guyuk had gotten along, if Subutai had been allowed to finish his campaign, the world you and I live in today would be unrecognizable. No Renaissance as we know it, because Italian city-states would have been conquered or destroyed. No age of exploration, because European kingdoms would have been subjugated. No Enlightenment, no Industrial Revolution, no Western democracy as we understand it. Not because these ideas couldn't exist under Mongol rule, some might have, but because the specific historical path that led to them would have been completely different. Think about that. Every aspect of modern Western civilization, the political systems, the cultural touchstones, the technological developments, all of it flows from a historical path that almost got cut off in 1241. We're living in the timeline where Europe survived, and sometimes I wonder if we appreciate how contingent that survival was, how easily it could have gone the other way. But let's talk about what actually did happen, because the legacy of 1241 is profound, even though the conquest failed. First, there's Hungary. King Belathorth, who fled during the Battle of Mohi, eventually returns to his devastated kingdom in 1242. And what he finds is heartbreaking. Half his population dead or fled, cities in ruins, the economy collapsed, the nobility decimated. It's a kingdom in name only. But Bela doesn't give up. He spends the next 28 years rebuilding. He invites settlers from other countries to repopulate devastated areas. He builds a network of stone castles across Hungary, hundreds of them, specifically designed to resist future Mongol invasions. He reforms the military, professionalizes the administration, strengthens royal authority. His reconstruction is so successful that historians call him the second founder of Hungary. He literally rebuilds a nation from ashes, and those castles he builds, many of them still stand today, 800 years later, monuments to one king's determination to ensure his kingdom would never be that vulnerable again. That's a powerful legacy. Tragedy transformed into resilience, destruction leading to stronger foundations. Hungary becomes a different kind of kingdom after 1241, more centralized, more militarized, more prepared for external threats. Poland goes through a similar transformation. The various Polish duchies, which had been fighting each other before the invasion, realized that disunity almost got them conquered. Over the following decades, they gradually moved toward reunification. The trauma of 1241 becomes a driving force for Polish national identity. Never again will we be so divided that foreign invaders can destroy us piecemeal. And here's something fascinating. The memory of the Mongol invasion becomes foundational to Central and Eastern European identity. Even today, in Poland and Hungary, the battles of Legnica and Mohi are commemorated. In Warsaw, there's a tomb of the unknown soldier, with an inscription listing important battles in Polish history. Legnica, April 9th, 1241, is right there. 800 years later, and they haven't forgotten. In Krakow, Poland, there's a tradition that dates back to the Mongol invasion. Every hour, a trumpeter plays a melody called the Hedźnał from the tower of St. Mary's Basilica. But the melody cuts off abruptly, incomplete. Legend says this commemorates a trumpeter who was shot by a Mongol arrow while trying to warn the city of the invasion. He died before finishing the call. Is the legend historically accurate? Probably not. But the fact that this tradition has continued for 800 years tells you something about how deeply the Mongol invasion scarred European consciousness. Now let's talk about military innovation, because this is where things get really interesting. The Mongol invasion of 1241 was a wake-up call for European military thinking. Everything Europeans thought they knew about warfare had just been proven obsolete. Their tactics didn't work. Their technology was inferior. Their organization was inadequate. So what do you do when your entire military doctrine becomes obsolete overnight? You adapt, you innovate, you learn. European kingdoms start studying Mongol tactics. They send observers to the Middle East, where Mongol armies are still fighting. They interview survivors who fought at Legnica and Mohi. They try to understand what made the Mongols so effective. And gradually, European warfare begins to change. More emphasis on light cavalry, better reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, more flexible command structures, greater use of missile weapons, crossbows, and eventually gunpowder weapons. Speaking of gunpowder, remember how the Mongols used primitive explosives at Mohi? Europeans took note. Within decades, European armies are experimenting with gunpowder. By the 1300s, cannons appear on European battlefields. By the 1400s, gunpowder weapons are revolutionizing warfare. Would this have happened without the Mongol invasion? Probably eventually. Gunpowder was a Chinese invention that would have spread westward regardless. But the Mongol invasion accelerated the process, made it urgent, demonstrated the military value of explosive weapons in ways that peaceful trade might not have. The Mongol invasion also forced European kingdoms to think about coordination and cooperation. Before 1241, European kingdoms mostly fought each other. The idea of multiple kingdoms working together against a common threat was relatively novel. But facing the Mongols, they had no choice. Pope Innocent IV's calls for unity, the various alliances and truces, the shared intelligence networks, these established patterns of cooperation that would influence European politics for centuries. Some historians argue that the concept of Europe as a unified civilization, rather than just a geographic region, was partly forged in response to the Mongol threat. "We're all in this together against the Eastern invaders" became a unifying narrative that transcended individual kingdom rivalries. Now, I mentioned earlier the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, and how it opened up trade routes. Let me expand on that because the cultural exchange that resulted is genuinely revolutionary. Before the Mongol conquests, Europe and China barely knew each other existed. Trade happened through multiple intermediaries over the Silk Road. Direct contact was almost non-existent. Cultural exchange was minimal. The Mongol Empire, by controlling the entire route from China to Eastern Europe, made direct contact possible for the first time in centuries. Marco Polo's famous journey to China in the 1270s happens because the Mongol Empire provides a relatively safe corridor for travel. And what comes back along these routes? Paper-making technology, advanced mathematics, astronomical knowledge, printing techniques, agricultural innovations, medical knowledge, silk, spices, 1,000 cultural influences flowing between East and West. Would the Renaissance have happened without this cross-cultural fertilization? Maybe, but it would have been different. The explosion of learning in Europe during the 1300s and 1400s was partly fueled by rediscovered Greek and Roman texts, yes, but also by new ideas and technologies from the East. The Mongol conquests, horrific as they were, helped connect the world in ways that hadn't been possible before. They created the first true globalized trade network, and Europe, instead of being conquered and absorbed into that network, got to participate in it as an independent civilization. That's a strange kind of legacy, isn't it? The invasion that almost destroyed Europe ended up helping to enrich it. There's also a darker, more complex legacy around how Europe remembered the Mongols. For centuries, Tatar or Mongol became synonymous with barbarism, cruelty, the ultimate foreign threat. This influenced European attitudes toward the East, toward non-Christian peoples, toward anyone who was other. The Mongol invasion reinforced European prejudices and fears in ways that had long-lasting negative consequences. It created a narrative of civilized Christian Europe versus barbaric Asian hordes that justified all kinds of problematic attitudes and policies. At the same time, there was a certain respect for Mongol military prowess. European military writers studied Mongol tactics with a mixture of fear and admiration. Subutai, when Europeans finally learned about him centuries later, was recognized as a military genius, even though he'd been their enemy. It's complicated. History usually is. Now let's talk about what this story means for us today, because I think there are lessons here that transcend the specific events of 1241. First lesson: civilization is fragile. We like to think of our societies as solid, permanent, inevitable, but history shows us again and again that things can change dramatically, quickly, unexpectedly. The Hungarians in early 1241 thought their kingdom was strong and secure. By the end of the year, half their population was dead. I'm not trying to be depressing here, just realistic. The structures we build, the societies we create, they're more vulnerable than we like to admit, which means we should appreciate them, maintain them, strengthen them, and not take them for granted. Second lesson: adaptation matters more than strength. The European kingdoms that survived the Mongol era weren't necessarily the strongest. They were the ones that learned, adapted, changed their tactics and strategies. Strength without flexibility is fragile. In our own lives, in our careers, in how we approach problems, adaptability is often more valuable than raw capability. The ability to learn from failure, to change course when necessary, to admit when your current approach isn't working, that's what survival often looks like. Third lesson: individual decisions have enormous consequences. One man's drinking problem literally changed world history. Subutai's strategic genius shaped continents. Ogeday's choice of succession law determined which civilizations survived and which fell. We tend to think of history as driven by big impersonal forces: economics, geography, technology, and those matter. But so do individual choices, individual moments, individual people. You never know which decision might end up mattering more than you could possibly imagine. Fourth lesson: nothing is inevitable. European historians used to tell the story of 1241 as if European survival was somehow natural or ordained, either by divine providence or by inherent European superiority. But that's not what the evidence shows. Europe survived through a combination of luck, strategic irrelevance from the Mongol perspective, and internal Mongol political problems. There was nothing inevitable about it, which means the opposite could have happened just as easily. When we look at our own time, our own challenges, we should remember, outcomes aren't predetermined. The future isn't inevitable. What happens depends on choices, chances, and circumstances, some of which we can control, many of which we can't. And finally, the past is more complex and more interesting than we usually give it credit for. The story of the Mongol invasion isn't a simple tale of good versus evil, civilization versus barbarism, West versus East. It's a complex narrative of military genius and political failure, of cultural exchange and massive destruction, of individual decisions and historical contingency. The more you dig into any historical event, the more fascinating it becomes, the more it defies simple categorization. And I think there's value in that complexity, in resisting the urge to simplify history into easy narratives. So here we are, 800 years later, still living with the consequences of events that happened in 1241. The world we inhabit today, the borders, the cultures, the political systems, all of it bears the mark of that year when Europe almost fell and somehow didn't. And somewhere in that story, I think there's something profound about resilience, about luck, about how history is made by a combination of grand strategy and random chance. of brilliant planning and unexpected accidents, of human ambition and human limitation. The Mongol invasion of Europe in 1241 remains one of the most fascinating near misses in history. A moment when everything could have changed, when one timeline nearly became another, when Western civilization as we know it almost ended before it really began. But it didn't end. Europe survived, adapted, learned, and eventually thrived. Not because it was destined to, not because it was inherently superior, but because in that particular historical moment, a series of events, some controllable, some not, happened to break in Europe's favour. And that's history. Not a story of inevitable progress or predetermined outcomes, but a contingent, complicated, endlessly fascinating record of how we got from then to now, one improbable step at a time. Thank you so much for staying with me through this long journey tonight. We've travelled from the frozen steppes of Mongolia to the killing fields of Poland and Hungary, from the strategic brilliance of Subutai to the drunken death of Genghis Khan, from the terror of near conquest to the strange luck of survival. I hope this story has given you something to think about history, about civilization, about how fragile and precious and contingent everything we take for granted really is. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most dramatic near misses, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because we've got so many more stories like this to explore. Tomorrow night, we'll be diving into another fascinating historical moment that changed the world in ways you might not expect. And hey, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What struck you most about this story? Did you know about the Mongol invasion before tonight? What other historical near misses would you like me to cover? Your engagement and feedback mean the world to me and help shape what we explore next. Until next time, sleep well, dream of history's infinite possibilities, and remember, the world we live in is just one of countless possible worlds, shaped by brilliant plans and random accidents, by human genius and human folly, by strategy and luck in equal measure. Good night, everyone. I'll see you in the next story.